This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It's this really cool spiritual group I'm part of, she explained. We're all about personal growth and supporting each other. I think you'd really vibe with it. I was hesitant at first. I'm not usually one for group activities, especially anything spiritual. But Annie was so enthusiastic and reassuring that I found myself agreeing before I could overthink it. We made plans to meet up that Saturday afternoon. When the day arrived, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as I drove to the address Annie had given me. It was a nondescript community center on the outskirts of town. As I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted Annie waiting by the entrance. She waved and came over to greet me with a warm hug. "I'm so glad you made it," she exclaimed. "Come on, I'll introduce you to everyone." She led me inside to a large room where about 15-20 people were milling about, chatting in small groups. The space was dimly lit with fairy lights strung up, and there was soft instrumental music playing. Everyone seemed friendly enough, smiling and nodding as Annie introduced me around the room. I noticed right away that many of the group members seemed a bit off. Not in a bad way necessarily, just different. There was a guy who avoided eye contact and kept fiddling with a Rubik's Cube. A woman who spoke in an unusually monotone voice. Another man who rocked back and forth slightly as he talked. It dawned on me that this might be some kind of neurodivergent support group. Once everyone had arrived, we all settled into a circle of chairs. A tall, charismatic man who introduced himself as Jake took charge, welcoming us all and explaining how the meeting would go. "Today we're going to be doing an exercise in emotional vulnerability," he announced. "It's important that we create a safe space where we can truly open up and connect with one another on a deeper level." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. This was already sounding more intense than I'd bargained for, but I didn't want to be rude by leaving, so I stayed put. Jake had us start by doing some deep breathing exercises. Then we went around the circle, introducing ourselves and sharing one thing we were grateful for. So far, so good. But things quickly took a turn. "Now," Jake said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality, "I want everyone to close their eyes. Think back to a moment in your life when you felt truly alone, a time when you were scared, vulnerable, abandoned. Really put yourself back in that headspace." The room fell silent except for the soft music. I reluctantly closed my eyes, not sure where this was going. "I want you to visualize that younger version of yourself," Jake continued. "See them standing there, small and afraid. Now imagine walking up to them, embracing them. Tell them it's going to be okay, that they are loved and worthy." I cracked an eye open and peeked around the room. Most people seemed fully immersed in the visualization. Some even had tears streaming down their faces. Annie, sitting next to me, was trembling slightly. "When you're ready, I want you to share that memory with the group," Jake instructed. "Don't hold back. This is a judgment-free zone where we can heal together." My stomach dropped. There was no way in hell I was about to spill my deepest traumas to a room full of strangers. But to my shock, people actually started sharing. Intense, deeply personal stories of abuse, loss, and pain poured out one after another. The woman next to me sobbed as she recounted being molested as a child. The guy with the Rubik's Cube described in vivid detail how he'd found his father's body after he'd had a heart attack. Annie shared about feeling worthless and suicidal after a bad breakup. With each story, Jake would interject with validating statements. You're so brave for sharing that. It wasn't your fault. You've come so far. He seemed to be guiding people to connect their past trauma to their current struggles and insecurities. As people opened up, the energy in the room became almost frenzied. There were lots of tears, hugging, declarations of love and support. It felt overwhelming and a bit artificial to me. I started to get a sick feeling in my stomach that something wasn't right here. When it was my turn to share, I mumbled something vague about feeling lonely as a kid and quickly passed it on to the next person. Jake gave me a sharp look, but didn't press me further. After the sharing circle, Jake had us pair up to do trust falls and other physical exercises meant to deepen our bond. I went through the motions, but my mind was racing. This whole thing felt manipulative and cult-like. Why was Annie, who I'd met on a dating app, so eager to bring me here? As soon as there was a break, I made my excuses and bolted for the door. Annie tried to stop me, insisting I stay for the closing meditation, but I brushed her off and practically ran to my car. Once home, I did some frantic Googling about the group. What I found made my blood run cold. There were several posts on Reddit and other forums from former members describing it as a predatory cult that used love bombing and trauma bonding to recruit vulnerable people. Apparently the leaders, including Jake, had a history of financial and sexual exploitation of members. They specifically targeted neurodivergent individuals who were lonely and seeking community, and they often used dating apps to find potential recruits. I felt sick realizing how close I'd come to getting sucked in. If I'd been in a more vulnerable place emotionally, who knows how it could have played out. I blocked Annie's number and reported her profile on the dating app. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. I kept replaying the events of that day in my mind, seeing all the red flags I'd missed. The way Jake skillfully manipulated people's emotions. How quickly everyone bonded over shared trauma. The pressure to conform and open up. I also couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few times I could have sworn I saw Annie's car driving by my apartment. Once I got a call from an unknown number and heard Jake's voice on the other end before I quickly hung up. It was probably just paranoia, but it left me constantly on edge. Even now, months later, I still feel uneasy thinking about that day. It's scary how easy it is to get drawn into something toxic when you're lonely and looking for connection. I'm just grateful I trusted my gut and got out when I did, but I often wonder about the others who weren't so lucky, especially Annie. I hope she found her way out too. I've become much more cautious about who I connect with online now, and I'm wary of any group or individual that pushes for deep emotional disclosure too quickly. That experience taught me an important lesson about trusting my instincts and maintaining strong boundaries. Sometimes I still have nightmares about being trapped in that room, forced to reveal my deepest wounds to hungry eyes. In the dreams, I try to leave, but the doors are locked, Jake's voice echoing as he commands us to go deeper, to give more of ourselves. I always wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. I know it's irrational, but part of me is always looking over my shoulder now, half expecting to see Jake or Annie following me. I've thought about moving to a new city, changing my name, anything to shake this lingering fear. But I try to remind myself that I'm safe, that I got away. Still, I can't help but wonder how many others have fallen prey to groups like that. How many lonely souls are out there right now, being love-bombed and manipulated, thinking they've finally found a place to belong. It makes me sick to think about. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Be careful who you trust, especially online. If something feels off, Listen to that instinct. Don't ignore red flags just because you're lonely or desperate for connection. Real, healthy relationships don't require you to bare your soul on day one. And if you're struggling or feeling alone, please reach out for legitimate help. There are so many amazing ethical support groups and therapists out there. Don't let predators masquerading as saviors take advantage of your vulnerability. I'm still working through the impact of that day with my therapist. Slowly but surely, I'm learning to trust my judgment again and open up to new connections. But I'll never forget how close I came to losing myself. Stay safe out there, everyone. And remember, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. It started on a chilly autumn evening. I was in my room, working on an essay, when I heard shouting from next door. At first, I tried to ignore it. Arguments weren't uncommon in our neighborhood. But then came the sound of breaking glass and a woman's scream. My heart racing, I peered out my window and saw a man dragging a woman by her hair across their front garden. Without thinking, I called the police. The cops arrived quickly and broke up the fight. I watched from behind my curtains as they took statements and eventually left. I felt relieved, thinking that was the end of it. How wrong I was. The next day, as I was leaving for class, I noticed the man from next door watching me intently from his window. His eyes were cold and predatory. A chill ran down my spine. I hurried away, telling myself I was being paranoid. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing him everywhere. He'd be outside when I left for uni, pretending to work on his car. I'd see him at the local shop, always a few aisles behind me. Once, I even spotted him lurking near campus. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I confided in my housemates, but they thought I was overreacting. "He's probably just a creep," my friend Emma said. "Just ignore him." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Things escalated one Friday night. My boyfriend Tom was visiting for the weekend. We'd had a nice dinner out and were cuddled up watching a movie in my room when we heard a strange scratching sound at the window. Tom paused the film and we listened intently. There it was again, a deliberate, persistent scratching. "It's probably just a tree branch," Tom whispered, but I could see the concern in his eyes. We crept to the window and peeked out. What I saw made my blood run cold. The man from next door was there, his face pressed against the glass, a manic grin spread across his features. When he saw us, he didn't run. He just stood there, staring. Tom yelled at him to leave, but he didn't budge. Instead, he started tapping on the glass with something metallic, a knife. I was frozen in terror. Tom grabbed my phone and called the police while I huddled in the corner, unable to look away from those crazed eyes boring into me. The next few minutes felt like hours. We could hear movement downstairs, more than one person. They were inside the house. Tom barricaded my bedroom door with my desk, but we both knew it wouldn't hold for long. The scratching at the window intensified, and now there was pounding on my door too. Just when I thought the door would give way, we heard sirens. The pounding stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Tom and I clung to each other, hardly daring to breathe until we heard a police officer calling out. When we finally opened the door, the scene that greeted us was chaos. My housemates were huddled in the hallway, pale and shaking. Police officers were everywhere. They'd caught two men trying to flee, our neighbor and another man I didn't recognize. Both were high on drugs and carrying knives. The following hours were a blur of statements and questions. It turned out our neighbor was a known drug dealer with a history of violence. He'd become fixated on me after I called the police that first night, seeing me as a threat to his operation. The police found a disturbing amount of evidence in his house suggesting he'd been planning this attack for weeks. I spent that night at a hotel, unable to face going back to the house. In the following days, I gave my official statement to the police and began the process of finding a new place to live. My housemates were supportive, equally shaken by what had happened. The hardest part was dealing with the aftermath. Every noise made me jump. I couldn't sleep without checking the locks multiple times. Even in broad daylight, I felt watched. The rational part of my brain knew my attacker was in custody, but the fear lingered. It's been a few months now, and I'm slowly starting to feel safe again. I moved to a new flat in a different part of the city. I'm in therapy, working through the trauma. Tom has been incredibly supportive, staying with me often and always making sure I feel secure. But there are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that man's face pressed against my window vivid in my mind. I don't know if I'll ever fully shake the feeling of vulnerability that experience left me with. It's a stark reminder of how quickly our sense of safety can be shattered. I often wonder what would have happened if Tom hadn't been there that night, or if the police hadn't arrived when they did. The thought makes me sick to my stomach. I'm grateful to be alive, but the experience has changed me forever. To anyone reading this, please trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't let anyone dismiss your concerns, and most importantly, don't be afraid to ask for help. I shudder to think what might have happened if I hadn't called the police that first night. I'm sharing this story not to scare anyone, but as a warning. We often think of danger as something distant, something that happens to other people. But sometimes it's right next door. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that there's no shame in being cautious. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time. I'm focusing on my studies, surrounding myself with supportive friends, and slowly rebuilding my sense of security. It's not easy, but I'm determined not to let this experience define me. I survived, and I'm stronger for it, but I'll never again take my safety for granted. I was just 16 when I first met Leo in my junior year of high school. He was the new kid, having transferred from another school across town. At first I thought he was kind of cute in that shy, awkward way. We had a few classes together and I'd catch him stealing glances at me sometimes. I figured he was just nervous about talking to girls. One day after chemistry class, he finally worked up the courage to come talk to me. He stammered out an invitation to study together sometime. I thought it was sweet how flustered he got, so I agreed. We exchanged numbers and started texting. At first, the texts were pretty normal, just casual conversation about classes, movies, music. But after only a couple days, things took a disturbing turn. Out of nowhere, Leo sent me an extremely graphic sexual message describing in vivid detail what he wanted to do to me. I was completely shocked and disgusted. This wasn't flirty or playful. It was vulgar and way over the line. I immediately told him that was totally inappropriate and to never send me anything like that again. He apologized profusely, claiming it was just a joke and begging me not to be mad. Against my better judgment, I decided to give him one more chance. I made it crystal clear that kind of message was unacceptable. For about a week, things went back to normal texts. Then late one night, I got another sexually explicit message from Leo, even worse than the first one. This time, I blocked his number without responding. I thought that would be the end of it. The next day at school, Leo cornered me between classes. He was agitated, demanding to know why I'd blocked him. I told him exactly why, and that I wanted nothing more to do with him. He got angry, calling me a tease, and saying I'd led him on. I was stunned by how quickly he turned hostile. I walked away, but that was far from the end. Later that week, I started getting creepy anonymous texts from unknown numbers. They were clearly from Leo. Same writing style, same gross sexual content. I'd block each new number, but he'd just use another one. It got to the point where I was afraid to even look at my phone. Every notification made my stomach drop. I never knew if it would be another vile message from Leo. I felt constantly on edge, dreading what might come next. Then things escalated even further. Leo somehow got a hold of some old selfies I'd taken in a bathing suit on a family beach trip. He started posting them all over social media, tagging me and adding captions implying they were recent, intimate photos I'd sent him. Of course, that was a total lie, but the damage was done. I was absolutely mortified. People at school were whispering and staring. Some guys made crude comments. I tried to explain they were old, innocent photos Leo had stolen, but not everyone believed me. My reputation was in tatters through no fault of my own. I went to the school administration, but they weren't much help. Since a lot of it was happening off campus via text and social media, they claimed there wasn't much they could do. They said it was a he said, she said situation without proof. I felt so betrayed and alone. The constant stress and anxiety were overwhelming. I started having trouble sleeping and concentrating in class. My grades began to slip. I'd always been a good student, but now I could barely focus with the constant fear of what Leo might do next. I begged my parents to let me switch schools, but they didn't understand the severity of the situation. They thought I was overreacting to normal teenage drama. If only they knew the half of it. I felt so trapped and helpless. The torment continued for months. Leo would back off for a while, lulling me into a false sense of security. Then he'd strike again with a barrage of graphic messages or by posting more stolen photos. It was like psychological warfare, never knowing when the next attack would come. I tried everything to shake him, changing my phone number, locking down all my social media, even dyeing my hair and changing my style. But he always found a way to get to me. It was like he had a sick obsession and wouldn't give up. By the time senior year rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. The constant harassment had taken such a toll on my mental health. I'd become withdrawn and paranoid, always looking over my shoulder. My former bubbly personality was gone, replaced by a shell of my former self. I counted down the days until graduation, praying that once high school was over, Leo would finally leave me alone. I planned to move away for college, hoping the distance would finally end this nightmare. The summer after graduation was blissfully quiet. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I started to relax and feel like myself again. I excitedly prepared for my new life at a university several hours away. My first semester of college was amazing. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and started to heal from the trauma of Leo's stalking. I thought I'd finally escaped and could put that awful chapter behind me. But my relief was short-lived. About 2 months into the semester, the messages started again. Somehow, Leo had tracked down my new number and social media accounts. The sexually explicit texts and threatening messages came pouring in, worse than ever before. I was devastated. I'd moved hundreds of miles away, started a whole new life. How had he found me? How could this still be happening? I felt utterly defeated, like there was no escaping this monster. I went to campus police, but they said there wasn't much they could do since Leo wasn't a student there. They suggested I file a report with the police in my hometown, but I knew from experience how unhelpful that would be. The harassment continued relentlessly. Leo seemed to know details about my new life, which dorm I lived in, what classes I was taking, even the name of the coffee shop where I studied. It terrified me to think he might have followed me here. I became a recluse, afraid to go anywhere or talk to anyone. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified I'd see Leo's face in a crowd. My grades tanked, and I was on the verge of dropping out. This psycho was ruining my life, and I felt powerless to stop him. It's been 3 years now since Leo first started stalking me. 3 years of constant fear, anxiety, and trauma. I've moved twice more since college, changed my name, and gone off the grid as much as possible. But he always manages to find me eventually. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. The police are useless. Restraining orders do nothing. I feel like a prisoner in my own life, never able to relax or feel safe. Will this torment ever end? Or am I doomed to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next message from my obsessed stalker? All I wanted was a normal life, to go to school, make friends, fall in love, pursue my dreams. Instead, I'm trapped in this waking nightmare with no way out. I don't know how much more I can take. I just want to be free. I was just a regular 20-year-old girl trying to live my life, but one encounter at the grocery store changed everything. It started innocently enough. I was picking up some groceries after work when I noticed a tall man in a Salvation Army uniform collecting donations near the entrance. He seemed friendly as I dropped a few coins in his bucket, smiling and thanking me. I thought nothing of it at the time, but over the next few weeks, I started noticing that same man every time I went to the store. At first, I assumed it was just coincidence. Maybe that was his regular post for collecting donations. But then I realized he wasn't always in uniform, and he seemed to be watching me intently as I shopped. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. One day, I was browsing the produce section when I glanced up and locked eyes with him. He was standing at the end of the aisle, staring directly at me with an unsettling intensity. I quickly looked away and hurried to another part of the store, my heart racing. From that moment on, I became hyper-aware of his presence. No matter where I went in the store, he always seemed to be lurking nearby. If I was in the dairy aisle, he'd conveniently need to grab something from the freezer section. If I was looking at cereal, he'd show up to examine the bread display across from me. It was like a twisted game of cat and mouse. I started dreading my weekly grocery trips. I'd put them off as long as possible, but eventually I'd have to go. Each time, I'd scan the parking lot nervously before getting out of my car. I'd rush through the store as quickly as possible, constantly looking over my shoulder, but he was always there, watching and following from a distance. The worst part was I felt completely powerless to do anything about it. This man towered over me. He had to be at least 6'5", while I'm barely 5'2". His sheer size was intimidating enough, but the predatory way he stalked me made me feel utterly helpless. I was too afraid to confront him directly. What if he got angry? What if he followed me home? I tried changing up my schedule, going to the store at different times, but somehow he always seemed to know when I'd be there. I even drove to a different grocery store across town a few times, but after the second visit, I saw him there too. How was this possible? Was I losing my mind? The constant stress and fear were taking a toll on me. I lost weight because I was too anxious to eat properly. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of being chased through endless grocery aisles. My work started to suffer as I struggled to focus on anything but the gnawing dread in my stomach. Finally, I broke down and told my grandfather what was happening. He had always been my rock, the person I turned to when I needed help or advice. As I sobbed and poured out the whole story, his face grew more and more concerned. When I finished, he hugged me tightly and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. We're going to take care of this." The next day, my grandfather insisted on accompanying me to the store. I was nervous, but having him there made me feel safer. Sure enough, within minutes of entering, I spotted my stalker lurking near the deli counter. I gripped my grandfather's arm and whispered, "That's him." My grandfather's eyes narrowed as he watched the man pretending to examine lunch meats while stealing glances in our direction. Without a word, he marched right up to the customer service desk and asked to speak to a manager. I trailed behind him, my stomach in knots. When the manager arrived, my grandfather didn't mince words. He explained the situation clearly and forcefully, describing how this man had been harassing and intimidating me for weeks. The manager looked shocked and immediately called for security to review the camera footage. As we waited, I saw my stalker quickly making his way towards the exit, but before he could leave, two burly security guards intercepted him. I watched from a distance, my heart pounding, as they spoke to him in low voices. He seemed agitated, gesturing wildly and shaking his head. The manager came back and confirmed that the security footage clearly showed the man following me around the store on multiple occasions. He assured us that the man would be permanently banned from the premises and trespassed if he ever returned. He also encouraged me to file a police report, which I did later that day. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But it was mixed with lingering fear and paranoia. What if he didn't stay away? What if he tried to retaliate? For weeks after, I was still on edge every time I went out in public. I'd flinch at the sight of any tall man, my heart racing until I confirmed it wasn't him. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows at home. I even took a self-defense class, hoping it would help me feel less vulnerable. Gradually, as time passed without any sign of him, I started to relax a little. But the experience left a lasting impact on me. I'm much more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings. I don't take my safety for granted anymore. Looking back, I still can't fully explain what happened. Why did this man fixate on me? What were his intentions? Was he just socially inept, or did he have something more sinister in mind? I'll probably never know for sure. What I do know is how quickly and seemingly innocent encounter can turn into something terrifying. That day, when I dropped those coins in his donation bucket, I had no idea I was setting in motion weeks of fear and anxiety. It's a chilling reminder that danger can lurk in the most ordinary places. I'm sharing my story now in hopes that it might help someone else. If you ever feel like you're being followed or watched, trust your instincts. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And remember, you're not alone. There are people who will believe you and support you, just like my grandfather did for me. These days, I still get a little tense when I go grocery shopping, but I refuse to let fear control my life. I walk with my head held high, keys clutched in my hand, just in case. And I always stay alert, because you never know when a trip to the store might turn into something much more sinister. Lucy and I had been best friends since freshman year of college. We bonded over our shared love of true crime podcasts and horror movies. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs. Her fascination with the dark and macabre, her need for constant attention and validation. But hindsight is 20/20, right? Everything changed when Lucy started dating Trevor. At first, I was happy for her. Lucy had always struggled with self-esteem issues and loneliness. Trevor seemed charming and attentive, showering her with compliments and little gifts. But slowly, subtly, he began to isolate her from her other friends. It started with small things. Lucy canceling plans at the last minute, saying Trevor surprised her with concert tickets or a romantic dinner. Then she stopped responding to our group chats. When we did hang out, she was constantly checking her phone, smiling at texts from Trevor. I tried to talk to her about it, gently pointing out how much time she was spending with Trevor and how we missed her. But Lucy got defensive, accusing me of being jealous and trying to sabotage her happiness. I backed off, not wanting to push her away completely. Weeks went by where I barely heard from Lucy at all. Then one night, around 2 a.m., I got a string of frantic texts from her. "Emily, I need you. Please come over. It's an emergency. I'm scared." My heart racing, I threw on some clothes and drove to Lucy's apartment. When I got there, she was waiting outside, pacing nervously. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she'd been crying. "Lucy, what's wrong? Are you okay?" I asked, rushing over to her. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly tight. "We need to go. Now, I'll explain in the car." Against my better judgment, I let her pull me towards my car. As soon as we were inside, Lucy told me to drive to an address across town. "Lucy, what's going on? You're scaring me," I said as I pulled out of the parking lot. "Just drive, Em, please. I promise I'll explain everything." The streets were eerily empty at that hour. As we drove, Lucy rambled almost incoherently about Trevor and how he was in trouble, something about owing money to dangerous people. She said we needed to help him. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked. "We can't involve the police," Lucy snapped. "Just trust me, okay?" We pulled up to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Lucy practically dragged me out of the car and up 3 flights of dingy stairs. The whole time, alarm bells were going off in my head. This felt wrong, dangerous. Lucy pounded on a door at the end of the hallway. After a moment, it creaked open and Trevor's face appeared in the gap. Even in the dim light, I could see his eyes were bloodshot and wild. "You brought her," he said to Lucy, his voice low and menacing. Before I could react, Trevor grabbed my arm and yanked me inside the apartment. Lucy followed, shutting and locking the door behind us. "What the hell is going on?" I yelled, trying to wrench my arm free from Trevor's iron grip. The apartment was a disaster. Takeout containers and empty bottles littered every surface. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and something else, a chemical smell I couldn't place. Trevor shoved me onto a stained couch. "Sit down and shut up," he snarled. I looked at Lucy in disbelief. "Lucy, what is this? Why did you bring me here?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, Em. We need your help." Trevor paced in front of us, ranting about people who were after him, how he needed money fast. I was having trouble following his erratic speech. "That's where you come in, Emily," he said, suddenly focused on me with terrifying intensity. "Your parents are loaded, right? You're going to call them and tell them you need $50,000 cash. Now." I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. This couldn't be happening. "You're insane," I said. "I'm not doing that. Lucy, let's go. Now." I stood up to leave, but Trevor shoved me back down hard. "You're not going anywhere until we get that money," he growled. I looked at Lucy desperately. "Lucy, please, this is crazy. Let's just leave, okay? Whatever trouble Trevor's in, this isn't the way to handle it." For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in Lucy's eyes. But then Trevor was there, wrapping an arm around her shoulders possessively. "Baby, remember what we talked about," he murmured in her ear. "Emily doesn't really care about you. She's always been jealous of us. But I love you. We're in this together." Lucy's face hardened as she looked at me. "I'm sorry, Em, but I need you to make that call." I couldn't believe this was happening. My best friend had lured me here to be held for ransom by her unhinged boyfriend. I felt sick. "I need to use the bathroom," I said, my mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. Trevor gestured towards a door off the living room. "Make it quick, and don't try anything stupid." I hurried into the tiny, filthy bathroom and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull my phone from my pocket. I had to get help. I opened my messages app, planning to text 911, but to my horror, there was no signal. Trevor must have had a signal jammer or something in the apartment. Panic rising in my throat, I looked around frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a rickety window above the toilet. Heart pounding, I climbed up and tried to force it open. It was painted shut. I could hear Trevor's angry voice getting louder outside the door. I was running out of time. In desperation, I grabbed the lid off the toilet tank and smashed it against the window. The old glass shattered surprisingly easily. "What the hell was that?" Trevor roared. I heard footsteps rushing towards the bathroom. Without thinking, I dove headfirst out the tiny window. I felt glass slicing my arms and face as I squeezed through. Then I was falling. I landed hard on a metal fire escape, the impact knocking the wind out of me, but adrenaline and terror propelled me forward. I scrambled down the fire escape as fast as I could, hearing Trevor's enraged shouts above me. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs were on fire and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, I collapsed in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. Sobbing and gasping for breath, I borrowed a kind stranger's phone to call the police. The next few hours were a blur of giving statements to stone-faced detectives and having my cuts treated by paramedics. They found Trevor's apartment empty. He and Lucy had fled as soon as I escaped. It's been 3 months since that night. Trevor was eventually arrested trying to cross the Canadian border. Lucy turned herself in a few weeks later. I've been in therapy, trying to process the betrayal and trauma. I still have nightmares about being trapped in that apartment. I jump at every unexpected sound. I'm paranoid about trusting new people, but I'm alive and I'm safe. I don't know if I'll ever understand how my best friend could do something like that to me. How she could choose an abusive, manipulative monster over our years of friendship. I guess you never really know someone, no matter how close you think you are. If you're reading this and see red flags in a friend's relationship, don't ignore them. Speak up. You might save them, or yourself, from unimaginable horror. And Lucy, if you somehow see this, I hope you get the help you need. But I will never, ever forgive you for what you did to me that night. Some betrayals cut too deep to ever heal. The house was dark and quiet, which wasn't unusual at this hour. My 4 housemates were probably asleep already, but there was a strange, musty smell in the air that I couldn't place. And did that chair in the living room look slightly out of place? I shook my head, trying to clear the paranoid thoughts. I was just tired and imagining things. Still, I found myself tiptoeing through the house, peering cautiously around corners as I made my way to the kitchen. Opening the fridge, I grabbed a yogurt and spoon, eager for a quick snack before bed. As I shut the door, movement caught my eye, a shadow passing by the basement doorway. My heart started racing. All my roommates' bedrooms were upstairs. Who could be down there? "Hello?" I called out shakily. No response. Clutching my phone, I inched towards the basement door. It was closed as always. We never used the basement. The landlord kept it locked up, saying it was just for storage and utilities. I put my ear to the door, straining to listen. At first, nothing. Then, the faintest sound of shuffling footsteps. Panic flooded through me. Someone was down there, someone who didn't belong. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. "There's an intruder in my house," I whispered urgently to the dispatcher. "Please hurry." The next few minutes were a blur. I raced upstairs, waking my roommates. We huddled together in Emma's room, listening fearfully for any sounds from below. When the police arrived, they found the basement door's lock had been picked. Descending the stairs with guns drawn, they discovered a hidden living space that made my skin crawl. An old mattress was wedged between boxes. Empty food wrappers and dirty dishes were scattered about. Disturbingly, some of the food containers and utensils were ones I recognized from our own kitchen. In the corner cowered a disheveled man, wild-eyed and reeking. The cops quickly subdued and cuffed him as we watched in horror from the top of the stairs. "How long has he been down there?" one officer asked us. We looked at each other, stunned. How long indeed? Gradually, all the strange occurrences of the past few months came flooding back. There was the time Jess swore someone had been in her room, rummaging through her closet. We'd dismissed her concerns, assuming she was just forgetful about where she put things. Or the mysterious disappearance of leftovers from the fridge. We'd blamed each other, leading to petty arguments. The occasional creaks and thumps in the night that we'd attributed to the old house settling. Even the musty smell I'd noticed earlier. It had been lingering for weeks. We'd assumed it was just typical dorm funk. All this time, a stranger had been living right under our noses, using our food, our belongings, moving freely through our home while we slept. The police estimated he'd been there for at least 2 months, possibly longer. They found a makeshift tool set he'd used to pick locks and jimmy windows. Our laptops and other valuables were discovered stashed in his basement lair, along with items we didn't recognize, probably stolen from other homes. As they led him away, the man stared at us with unsettling intensity. I'll never forget the hungry look in his eyes, like a predator eyeing prey. What had he been planning? What might have happened if we hadn't caught him? The following days were a nightmare of police statements, crime scene investigators, and frantic calls from worried parents. We learned the intruder was a drifter with a history of breaking and entering. He'd been targeting student housing, taking advantage of lax security and the chaotic nature of shared living spaces. Our landlord was mortified, claiming he had no idea how the man had accessed the secure basement. He offered to install an alarm system and new locks, but it was too late. None of us felt safe in that house anymore. We broke our lease and moved out within the week, crashing with friends until we could find new housing. But the damage was done. For months afterwards, I battled insomnia and anxiety. Every creak or shadow would send my heart racing. I became obsessed with checking locks and peering into closets. Even now, years later, I'm not fully over it. I'm hyper-vigilant about home security. I have trouble trusting new roommates or neighbors. Part of me is always on edge, wondering if danger is lurking just out of sight. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that night. In my dreams, I'm wandering our old house, sensing a presence, but unable to find its source. I open the basement door, descending into darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, a pair of hungry eyes gleam in the blackness. I try to scream, but no sound comes out. I try to run, but my legs won't move. I'm frozen as the eyes draw closer, closer. Then I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. On those nights, sleep doesn't come again easily. I lie awake, listening to every tiny sound, unable to shake the feeling that I'm not truly alone. I know it's irrational. I know the intruder is long gone, locked away where he can't hurt anyone. But the primal fear lingers, because for months my friends and I lived alongside a predator and never knew it. Our supposed safe haven was anything but, and I can't help but wonder, what other dangers might be hiding in plain sight, just waiting to be discovered? The experience changed me in ways I'm still unpacking. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. I take nothing for granted when it comes to safety. Some might call it paranoia, but I see it as hard-earned wisdom. After all, you never truly know what's lurking in the shadows, or who might be listening from the other side of a locked door. I hope sharing my story serves as a wake-up call. Please, don't make the same mistakes we did. Be vigilant. Trust your instincts if something feels off, and never assume you're truly safe, even in your own home, because sometimes the monster under the bed is all too real, and it might be closer than you think. I was scrolling through my phone when I got a text from my best friend KK. "Hey girl, want to come with me to meet this guy Joey tomorrow? He seems cool, but I'm kind of nervous to go alone." I hadn't heard her mention a Joey before, so I asked who he was. Turns out she'd been chatting with him on social media for a couple weeks after he randomly followed her. They'd hit it off and he'd asked to meet up. I'll admit I was a bit wary. Meeting up with some random dude from the internet? Not exactly the safest plan. But KK seemed excited, and I didn't want to be a buzzkill. Plus, I figured if I went along, at least she wouldn't be alone. "Sure, I'll come with." "Where are you meeting him?" KK explained that Joey had suggested meeting at this little diner near her uncle's farm, about 30 minutes outside the city. It was a place she knew well from childhood visits. "We can take my car and make a day of it. Grab lunch, maybe go for a walk around the property after. It'll be fun." The next day, I picked KK up and we headed out to the countryside. As we drove, she filled me in on what she knew about Joey. He was 26, worked in construction, loved country music and four-wheeling. She showed me his profile pic. Tall, muscular guy with tattoos and a snapback hat. Not really my type, but KK seemed into him. We got to the diner around 1 p.m. It was a tiny place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. Only a couple other patrons inside. We slid into a booth and ordered sodas while we waited for Joey. 20 minutes went by, then 30. KK kept checking her phone, but no messages from Joey. "Maybe he's just running late," she said, but I could tell she was getting anxious. Just as we were debating whether to leave, the bell over the door jingled, and in walked a guy matching Joey's picture. He slid into the booth next to KK, flashing a wide grin. "Hey there, darlin'. Sorry I'm late. Got held up at work." He barely glanced my way as he put his arm around KK's shoulders. Something about him immediately set me on edge. Maybe it was the way his eyes kept darting around the diner, or how tightly wound he seemed despite his easygoing demeanor. We ordered food and made awkward small talk. Joey dominated the conversation, going on about his truck and his job and his workout routine. He kept touching KK, squeezing her shoulder, brushing her hair back. She seemed a bit uncomfortable, but was trying to play it cool. About halfway through the meal, Joey's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then quickly shoved it in his pocket. "Hey, how about we get out of here? I know a nice spot down by the creek we could walk to." KK hesitated. "Oh, I was thinking we could go check out my uncle's farm, actually. Show you guys around a bit." Joey's jaw tightened for a split second before he plastered on another smile. "Aw, come on. The creek's way more fun. I promise you'll love it." I decided to pipe up. "The farm sounds great to me. I'd love to see it, KK." Joey shot me an irritated look. "Nobody asked you, sweetheart. Why don't you head on home and let me and KK have some alone time?" Alarm bells were blaring in my head now. I opened my mouth to argue, but KK cut in. "Actually, Joey, I think I'd rather go to the farm too. Maybe another time for the creek?" Joey's whole demeanor changed in an instant. His eyes went cold, and he gripped KK's arm hard. "Listen here, we're going to the fucking creek, got it? Now let's go." He started to slide out of the booth, yanking KK with him. I jumped up. "Hey, let go of her." The few other people in the diner were staring now. Joey glared at me but released KK's arm. "Fine. Have it your way, bitches." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. KK and I stood there shaking for a minute. The waitress came over asking if we were okay. We nodded, paid our bill, and got the hell out of there. As we speed-walked to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting Joey to jump out at us. We made it to the car, and KK peeled out of the parking lot. We drove in tense silence for a few minutes before KK pulled over on the side of the road and burst into tears. "Oh my God, I'm so stupid. I can't believe I fell for his bullshit online. Thank you so much for coming with me." I hugged her, my own hands still trembling. "It's okay, you're not stupid. That guy was a total creep. I'm just glad we got out of there." KK wiped her eyes and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my uncle to let him know we're coming. I just want to be somewhere safe right now." As she dialed, I decided to Google this Joey guy, see if I could find anything sketchy. What I found made my blood run cold. "KK, you need to see this." I turned my phone to show her the search results. Multiple news articles about a Joey Crack Williams wanted for a string of assaults and robberies in the area. The mugshot matched our Joey perfectly. KK's face went white. "Oh, fuck. Oh, fuck, fuck, fuck." She quickly told her uncle we were on our way and to please meet us at the end of the driveway. Then she floored it. We made it to her uncle's farm in record time. Her uncle was waiting for us in his pickup, looking concerned. KK filled him in on what happened as we followed him up to the house. Once inside, KK's aunt made us some tea to calm our nerves, while her uncle called the police. As we waited for them to arrive, KK's phone buzzed. She hesitated before opening the message. "It's from Joey," she whispered. Her hands shook as she read it aloud. "You bitches think you're so smart, huh? Guess what? I know where your uncle's farm is. I've been watching you. I know all about your little routine there. Was gonna wait till you were alone to have my fun, but now you've pissed me off. Sleep tight tonight. I'll be seeing you real soon." KK dropped the phone like it had burned her. I felt like I was going to be sick. Her uncle immediately started checking all the doors and windows, while her aunt called the police again to update them. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and questions. They took Joey's picture and promised to step up patrols in the area. But they couldn't do much else without proof he'd actually done anything yet. KK and I were too scared to leave, so we stayed at her aunt and uncle's that night. We barely slept, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, Bleary-eyed and exhausted, we decided to head back to the city where we'd at least be around more people. As we were getting ready to leave, KK got another message. This one was a video. With shaking hands, she pressed play. It showed the creek Joey had wanted us to go to. The camera panned around, showing rope and duct tape laid out on the ground. Joey's voice came from off-screen. "See what you missed out on, ladies? Don't worry, I'm a patient man. I'll get what I want eventually." We went straight to the police station with the video. They took it as evidence, but warned us it still might not be enough for an arrest. All we could do was stay vigilant and report any other contact. It's been a month now. Joey seems to have disappeared. No more messages, no sightings. But I still find myself looking over my shoulder constantly. KK hardly leaves her apartment these days. I can't stop thinking about how close we came to God knows what. If we'd gone along with Joey's plan, I don't even want to imagine. I'm beyond grateful we trusted our instincts that day. But I'm also angry. Angry that creeps like Joey are out there. Angry that women have to constantly be on guard. I don't know if we'll ever feel truly safe again. But I do know this. I'll never ignore that little voice in my head telling me something's wrong. And I'll never stop looking out for my friends. Because sometimes that's the only thing standing between us and monsters like Joey. We'd been planning the trip for months. Dad was always big on the outdoors, wanted to toughen us up or something. Mom went along with it, though camping wasn't really her thing. Jenny and I were psyched. 3 whole days of exploring, roasting marshmallows, and staying up late telling ghost stories. The drive up was beautiful, towering evergreens, jagged mountain peaks, crystal clear streams. We sang along to cheesy 80s pop on the radio and played I Spy. Everything felt perfect. We reached the trailhead by early afternoon and loaded up our backpacks. Amber was bouncing around, tail wagging a mile a minute. The hike in was tough, especially for Jenny and me lugging our overpacked bags. But the views were worth it. We set up camp in a small clearing near a bubbling creek, surrounded by massive Douglas firs. Dad got a fire going while Mom supervised our attempts at pitching tents. As the sun started to set, we scarfed down hot dogs and s'mores. That first night was magical. The stars were so bright, like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. Jenny and I lay on our backs, pointing out constellations and making up stories about aliens and space explorers. The grown-ups were drinking wine by the fire. Amber was curled up between us, snoring softly. I remember thinking I never wanted this moment to end. If only I'd known what was coming. The next morning, we woke to bird calls and dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal, we set out to explore. Dad led us on a day hike to a nearby waterfall. The trail was steep and challenging, but the payoff was incredible. A 100-foot cascade of frothing white water plunging into a deep blue pool. We were heading back to camp, about a mile out, when we first saw him. A man standing motionless just off the trail. He was thin, almost gaunt, with wild gray hair and a scraggly beard. But what struck me most was his clothing. Dress pants, a button-down shirt, and leather shoes. Who dresses like that for a hike? As we passed, he just stared. Didn't say a word, didn't even blink. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I gripped Jenny's hand tightly. Dad called out a greeting, but the man remained silent. We quickened our pace, and I could feel his eyes boring into my back until we rounded a bend in the trail. That night, the carefree mood was gone. Mom and Dad spoke in hushed tones by the fire. Jenny and I huddled in our tent, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Even Amber seemed on edge, growling softly at the darkness beyond our campsite. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, it was dawn. As we emerged from our tents, bleary-eyed and groggy, Mom let out a strangled gasp. Our campsite had been ransacked. Food was strewn everywhere, backpacks emptied, clothes scattered. But nothing seemed to be missing. It was like someone had torn through our belongings just for the sake of chaos. Dad's face was grim as he quietly told us to pack up. We were cutting the trip short. As we hurriedly stuffed our gear into bags, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest that had seemed so welcoming now felt oppressive, hiding unseen threats behind every tree. We practically jogged back to the trailhead, jumping at shadows. About halfway there, Jenny screamed. The strange man from yesterday was there again, standing just off the path. This time, he was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was predatory, hungry. Dad yelled at him to stay back, brandishing a heavy walking stick. The man took a step forward, then another. Suddenly, Amber lunged forward, snarling and snapping. The man's smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Dad grabbed Amber's collar, and we ran. We burst out of the tree line into the parking area, gasping for breath. Relief washed over me as I saw our station wagon, until Dad swore loudly. All 4 tires had been slashed. The radio antenna was snapped off. Deep scratches marred the paint. Mom was on the verge of hysterics. Jenny was sobbing. I felt like I was going to throw up. Dad was trying to calm everyone down when we heard the crunch of gravel. I whirled around, heart pounding, expecting to see our tormentor. Instead, it was a forest ranger in a green pickup truck. He took one look at our faces and our damaged car and immediately radioed for backup. As we gave our statements, more rangers arrived. They sent out search parties, but found no sign of the strange man. We never went camping again after that. For months, I had nightmares about being chased through dark woods. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that man's dead-eyed stare, that twisted smile. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, waiting in the shadows of those beautiful, terrible mountains. I don't know what would have happened if that ranger hadn't shown up when he did. All I know is that our family vacation turned into 3 days of terror that haunt me to this day. The worst part? We never found out who he was or what he wanted. That lingering uncertainty, the questions left unanswered. They're almost worse than knowing the truth. So if you're planning a trip to the Cascades, be careful. Watch your surroundings. And if you see a man in a suit where no man in a suit should be, run, run, and don't look back. Don't get me wrong, I loved my job. The Red Lion had character, worn wooden beams, uneven stone floors, a massive hearth that dominated one wall. During busy hours, it was cozy and charming. But in the quiet moments before opening, when I was alone with the building's creaks and shadows, it felt different. I shook off the unease and got to work, wiping down tables and restocking the bar. My co-worker Lizzie was due in soon, and I knew she'd want everything perfect before we opened. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the pub was empty. Finally, Lizzie arrived, her cheerful voice breaking the eerie silence. "Evening, mate. Ready for another exciting night of serving pints to the locals?" She grinned as she tied on her apron. I forced a smile. "Yeah, can't wait." I hesitated, then added, "Hey, Liz, does this place ever feel, I don't know, off to you?" She raised an eyebrow. "Off how?" I shrugged, feeling foolish. "Never mind. Let's finish setting up." As we worked, Lizzie chattered about her day. I half listened, still distracted by the pub's oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, a loud thump from upstairs made us both jump. "What was that?" Lizzie whispered, eyes wide. "Probably just the building settling," I said, not believing it myself. "This place is ancient, after all." Lizzie nodded, but I could see she was spooked. An idea formed. Maybe I could have a bit of fun with this. "You know," I said casually, "I've heard stories about this place being haunted." Lizzie's eyes widened further. "Really? By what?" I leaned in conspiratorially. "They say the ghost of the original owner still wanders the halls at night. Apparently he was murdered right here in the pub." Lizzie shivered. "Stop it. You're creeping me out." I grinned, enjoying her reaction. "I'm serious. Haven't you ever noticed strange noises or things moving on their own?" Before Lizzie could respond, we heard it, clear as day, the sound of footsteps from the floor above us. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the ceiling. The color drained from Lizzie's face. That's not funny," she stammered. I felt my own smile fade. This wasn't me playing a prank anymore. "I'm not doing anything," I said quietly. We stood frozen, listening as the footsteps continued. They seemed to be moving towards the stairs that led down to the main bar area. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Lizzie and I exchanged terrified glances. Maybe we should check it out," I suggested weakly, though every fiber of my being screamed against the idea. Lizzie shook her head vehemently. "No way. I'm not going up there." Before I could argue, we heard something else. Voices, muffled, indistinct, but unmistakably coming from the supposedly empty floor above us. It sounded like a conversation, though we couldn't make out any words. "This isn't happening," Lizzie whispered, her voice shaking. "This can't be real." I wanted to comfort her, to say it was all a misunderstanding, but I couldn't find the words, because deep down I knew this was real, and it was terrifying. The voices continued, rising and falling in a ghostly cadence. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, pressing down on us like a physical weight. "We should leave," Lizzie said, her voice barely audible. "Right now." I nodded, unable to speak. We began backing towards the door, our eyes fixed on the staircase leading to the upper floor. Just as we reached the exit, a new sound froze us in place, the creak of a door opening upstairs. Footsteps again, but this time coming down the stairs. Slow, measured steps. Thump, thump, thump. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Lizzie clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. We watched in horror as a figure emerged from the stairwell. It was a man, or at least the shape of a man. He wore old-fashioned clothes, a waistcoat, breeches, and a tricorn hat. But his features were blurred, indistinct, as if he wasn't quite there. He moved with an unnatural smoothness, seeming to glide rather than walk. The figure paused at the bottom of the stairs, turning slowly to face us. Though I couldn't make out his eyes, I felt his gaze upon me. A chill ran down my spine, so intense it was almost painful. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff with this impossible apparition. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked towards the back of the pub. He passed through the closed door leading to the cellar as if it wasn't there at all. The moment he disappeared, the spell was broken. Lizzie let out a choked sob and bolted for the door. I was right behind her, my legs shaking so badly I could barely run. We burst out into the cool night air, gasping and trembling. Lizzie was crying, and I realized I was on the verge of tears myself. "What was that?" Lizzie managed between sobs. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. We stood there for several minutes, neither of us willing to go back inside. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "We need to call the manager." Lizzie nodded, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. As she dialed, I kept my eyes fixed on the pub's entrance, half expecting our ghostly visitor to come strolling out. Our manager, Bill, arrived about 20 minutes later. He found us huddled by Lizzie's car, still too scared to go back inside. As we recounted what had happened, his expression grew increasingly grim. When we finished, Bill sighed heavily. "I was afraid this might happen eventually," he said. Lizzie and I exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean?" I asked. Bill ran a hand through his thinning hair. "The Red Lion has a history. There have been stories about strange occurrences here for generations. I've experienced a few myself over the years." "Why didn't you tell us?" Lizzie demanded, her voice a mix of anger and fear. "Would you have taken the job if I had?" Bill countered. When neither of us responded, he continued, "Look, I know it's frightening, but the spirit, or whatever it is, has never harmed anyone. It's just part of the pub's character." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Part of its character? We saw a ghost, Bill. An actual honest-to-God ghost." Bill nodded solemnly. "I believe you, and I'm sorry you had to experience it like this. But now that you know, we need to decide how to move forward." Lizzie shook her head vehemently. "I'm not going back in there, ever." I wanted to agree with her, but something held me back. Despite the terror I'd felt, there was also a strange fascination. I found myself wondering about the ghost, who he had been, why he was still here. I think I need some time to process this," I said slowly. Bill nodded. "Of course. Take the next few days off, both of you. We'll talk again when you've had a chance to calm down." As we prepared to leave, I couldn't help but glance back at the pub. In one of the upstairs windows, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadowy figure watching us. I blinked, and it was gone. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow in my apartment. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. Part of me wanted to never set foot in the Red Lion again, but another part, a part I didn't quite understand, felt drawn back. When Bill called to check in, I surprised myself by saying I was ready to return to work. Lizzie, unsurprisingly, had quit. I couldn't blame her. My first shift back was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. But as the night wore on and nothing out of the ordinary happened, I began to relax. It was near closing time when I saw him again. I was wiping down tables when movement caught my eye. There, by the cellar door, stood the ghostly figure. He was clearer this time. I could make out weathered features, sad eyes, and a wistful expression. For a moment, our gazes met. I felt no fear this time, only a profound sense of melancholy. Then, with a nod that seemed almost respectful, he faded away. I've seen him several times since then, always briefly, always at a distance. I've grown accustomed to his presence, even find it oddly comforting at times. The Red Lion isn't just a pub, it's a bridge between worlds, a place where the past and present intermingle. I don't try to explain it anymore. Some things, I've learned, defy explanation. But on quiet nights, when the pub is empty and the old building creaks and sighs, I raise a glass to my spectral co-worker. After all, we're both just doing our jobs. His just happens to last a bit longer than mine. It was around 2 a.m., and the shelter was quiet. Most of the women and children were asleep in their rooms. I was at the front desk, catching up on some paperwork, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured one of the residents was probably up getting a drink of water or something. But then I realized the footsteps sounded off. They were too heavy to be one of the women and had an echoing quality that sent chills down my spine. I got up to investigate, my heart starting to race a bit. As I peered down the dark hallway, the footsteps suddenly stopped. I called out softly, not wanting to wake anyone, but got no response. After a moment of tense silence, I convinced myself I must have imagined it and went back to my desk. Not 5 minutes later, I heard a loud scraping sound from the common room. It sounded exactly like one of the heavy wooden chairs being dragged across the floor. Now thoroughly unnerved, I grabbed my flashlight and went to check it out. The common room was empty and still when I entered. But as the beam of my flashlight swept across the room, I saw that one of the chairs was indeed out of place, sitting in the middle of the room instead of tucked under the table where it belonged. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I knew for a fact that chair hadn't been there earlier when I'd done my rounds. I quickly put it back and practically ran back to the front desk, my mind racing. Over the next few hours, more strange things kept happening. Doors would creak open on their own. I'd hear whispers and what sounded like sobbing coming from empty rooms. At one point, I distinctly felt someone brush past me in the hallway, but when I whirled around, no one was there. By the time my co-worker Jen arrived to relieve me at 6 a.m., I was a nervous wreck. I tried to play it cool as I gave her the overnight report, not wanting to sound crazy, but she must have sensed something was off because she kept giving me concerned looks. Finally, she asked, "Hey, you okay? You seem really on edge." I hesitated, then decided to confide in her. "Jen, I know this is going to sound insane, but some really weird stuff happened last night. I kept hearing noises and things moving on their own. I swear I'm not making this up." To my surprise, Jen didn't look skeptical. Instead, her face grew serious. "You too, huh? I was hoping it was just me." My eyes widened. "Wait, what do you mean?" Jen sighed and lowered her voice. "I didn't want to say anything because I thought people would think I was nuts. But I've been experiencing some seriously creepy stuff during my shifts too. Seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, hearing voices when no one's around. Last week I swear I saw a woman standing at the end of the hall, but when I blinked she was gone." I felt a mix of relief and fear wash over me. I wasn't going crazy, but that meant something truly unexplainable was happening here. Over the next few weeks, the paranormal activity only escalated. More staff members started reporting bizarre experiences. Objects would go missing, only to turn up in strange places. The overhead lights would flicker and dim for no reason. Some of the women staying at the shelter even said they'd woken up to see dark figures looming over their beds. We were all on edge, jumping at every little sound, but we tried to keep things as normal as possible for the sake of the residents. These women had already been through so much trauma. The last thing they needed was to feel unsafe in what was supposed to be their refuge. One night, about a month after my first experience, things came to a head. I was working with my co-worker, Mike, and the shelter was unusually full. We had several new arrivals, including a young mother and her toddler, who had just fled an extremely violent situation. Around midnight, we started hearing a child crying. At first, we assumed it was the toddler, but when we went to check, the mother said her son was sound asleep. As we stood there confused, the crying grew louder. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly the lights began to flicker wildly. A wind came out of nowhere, whipping through the halls with unnatural force. Doors started slamming open and shut. Picture frames flew off the walls. The women came running out of their rooms in a panic. In the chaos, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of what looked like smoky, shadowy figures had materialized in the common room. They were vaguely human-shaped but distorted and wrong somehow. As I watched in horror, they seemed to be reaching out towards us with wispy arms. Mike saw them too. He grabbed my arm, his face pale. What the hell are those things? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get everyone out of there, fast. We quickly rounded up all the residents and ushered them outside to the parking lot. As soon as the last person crossed the threshold, everything stopped. The wind died down, the lights stabilized, and when I looked back, the shadow figures had vanished. We ended up having to relocate all the residents to a hotel for the night. The next day, we brought in a psychic medium to try to get to the bottom of what was happening. She walked through the shelter, growing more and more disturbed. Finally, she turned to us with a grim expression. "This place is haunted by the spirits of women who didn't make it out of their abusive situations," she said softly. "They're drawn here because it represents the safety they never found in life. But their pain and anger is so strong, it's manifesting in these disturbing ways." The medium performed a cleansing ritual, and we haven't had any major incidents since then. But there's still a heaviness in the air sometimes, a feeling of being watched. Late at night, I'll catch glimpses of shadows in my peripheral vision, or hear the faint sound of weeping. We've all learned to live with it. In a way, it's a reminder of why our work is so important, of all the women we weren't able to save, but also of all the ones we can still help. The shelter remains a place of safety and new beginnings, and maybe, in some small way, we're helping those lost spirits find peace too. I'll never forget that night when the supernatural and the real world collided in such a terrifying way. It opened my eyes to forces beyond our understanding, but it also showed me the strength of the human spirit, both in the living and the dead. I continue my work at the shelter, helping women rebuild their lives, and sometimes, in quiet moments, I swear I can feel those spirits watching over us, silently cheering us on. The bell above the door chimed, startling me out of my daze. I looked up, expecting to see some bleary-eyed truck driver in need of coffee. Instead, an elderly woman shuffled through the entrance. She was small and frail-looking, wrapped in a faded floral housecoat that seemed out of place for a late-night gas station run. "Excuse me, dear," she called out in a quavering voice. "I was wondering if you might have any Werther's Originals, the butterscotch ones, you know." I blinked, thrown off by the oddly specific request. Let me check for you, ma'am." I scanned the candy aisle, but didn't see any Werther's. "I'm sorry, I don't think we carry those. Is there something else I can help you with?" The old woman's face fell. "Oh, that's a shame. My Harold always loved those candies. I was hoping to bring him some." She glanced around the store with a lost expression. "This place has changed so much. It used to be our favorite stop on road trips, you know, back when Harold could still drive." An uncomfortable feeling began to creep over me. Something about this interaction felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. "I'm sorry about that, ma'am. We get new stock sometimes, so maybe check back another time?" She nodded absently, still looking around the store. "Yes, perhaps. It's just, I promised Harold I'd bring him his favorites. He's been so lonely lately. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't sure why, but a chill ran through me at her words. "Is there anything else I can help you with tonight?" I asked, hoping she'd leave soon so I could shake off this weird feeling. "No, I suppose not," she sighed. "I'll just be on my way then. You take care, dear." With that, she turned and shuffled back out the door. I watched through the windows as she slowly made her way across the parking lot, eventually disappearing into the darkness beyond the lights. I tried to go back to stocking shelves, but I couldn't focus. That encounter had seriously creeped me out, though I still couldn't articulate why. After a few minutes of fumbling with boxes, I decided to ask my manager about it. Maybe he'd know if we'd ever carried Werther's originals. I found Jim in the back office doing paperwork. "Hey, quick question," I said. "Have we ever sold Werther's candies here? An old lady just came in asking for them." Jim looked up, his brow furrowed. "Werther's? Nah, we've never had those. Wait, did you say an old lady came in asking for them?" I nodded. "Yeah, just a few minutes ago. Kinda weird, right?" Jim's face went pale. He stood up so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "What did she look like?" he demanded. Taken aback by his reaction, I stammered out a description. Small? Maybe in her 80s? White hair, floral house coat? Why? What's wrong?" Jim sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. "Kid, I think you just saw a ghost." I laughed nervously. "Come on, man. Don't mess with me like that." But Jim wasn't laughing. He looked dead serious. "I'm not joking. That sounds exactly like Mrs. Elkins. She and her husband used to come here all the time years ago, but she died about 2 months back." My blood ran cold. That's not possible," I stammered. "She was right here. I talked to her." Jim shook his head. "I'm telling you, Mrs. Elkins passed away. Heart attack, if I remember right. It was in all the local papers. Her husband had died a few years before, and folks said she was never the same after." I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. This couldn't be real. There had to be some explanation. Maybe it was just someone who looked like her, I suggested weakly. "Maybe," Jim said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Look, why don't you take your break early? Get some fresh air, clear your head." I nodded numbly and stumbled out of the office. Instead of going outside, though, I locked myself in the employee bathroom. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called my grandmother. She was a notorious night owl, so I knew she'd be up. "Hey, sweetie, everything okay?" she answered on the second ring. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. "Listen, Grandma, this is gonna sound weird, but do you still have access to the online archives for the local paper?" "Of course, dear. Why do you ask?" I took a deep breath. "I need you to look up obituaries from about 2 months ago. I'm looking for information on a Mrs. Elkins." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. "Let's see. Here we are. Elizabeth Elkins, aged 82, passed away on March 15th. Oh, that's so sad. I remember reading about this. Her husband had died a few years back, and she never really recovered." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear. "Grandma, does it have a picture?" "Yes, it does. Such a sweet-looking lady. White hair, kind eyes. The photo shows her in a floral housecoat, actually. Must have been one of her favorites." I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold tile floor. "Grandma, I need you to send me that picture right now." She must have heard the urgency in my voice because she didn't ask questions. A moment later, my phone buzzed with an incoming message. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The woman smiling back at me from the obituary photo was unmistakably the same one I'd spoken to not 20 minutes ago. I don't remember much of the rest of that night. Jim found me in the bathroom, hyperventilating. He covered the rest of my shift and drove me home. I called in sick for the next few days, unable to face going back to that gas station. It's been weeks now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to find some rational explanation. But I know what I saw. I know who I talked to. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about Mrs. Elkins. Did she find her way to Harold? Did she ever get him those Werther's originals? And most of all, I wonder, if she came back once, will she come back again? I still work at the gas station. I had to. Bills don't pay themselves, but I requested to be moved to day shifts only. I tell myself it's because I prefer the hours, but deep down, I know the truth. I'm afraid of who or what might come wandering in during those long, lonely night shifts. Every time the bell above the door chimes, I tense up. Every elderly customer makes my heart race. And every time someone asks for candy we don't carry, I feel that same chill run down my spine. I don't know if I believe in ghosts. I'm not sure I want to. But I know that something happened that night, something I can't explain. And in the quiet moments, when the world feels suspended between reality and dreams, I find myself wondering about the thin veil between life and death, and how easily it might be crossed by someone with unfinished business. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see a gas station glowing like a beacon in the darkness, maybe think twice before stopping in. You never know who or what you might encounter. And if an elderly lady in a floral housecoat asks you for Werther's originals, well, you might want to start running. Verwitkiezens. I'd been working at this small cafe for about 6 months. It wasn't glamorous, but I enjoyed the work, and my coworkers were nice. Things were going pretty well until he started showing up. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another regular customer who came in a few times a week for coffee. But then I started noticing how he always seemed to time his visits for when I was working. How his eyes followed me as I moved around behind the counter. The way he'd linger long after finishing his drink, pretending to read the newspaper. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, something about him made me uneasy. The way he'd lean in too close when ordering, how he always had some excuse to talk to me. Then he started waiting outside after my shifts. I'd walk out and see him standing there, pretending to be on his phone. He'd coincidentally be heading the same direction as me, trying to strike up conversation. I started varying my routes home, ducking into shops to lose him. I told my manager about it, but she just said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually did something. "He's a paying customer," she said with a shrug. I felt so helpless and alone. Things escalated when he somehow got my phone number. I still don't know how. The texts started flooding in. At first, just friendly messages, then increasingly sexual and threatening when I didn't respond. I blocked his number, but he'd just use a new one. I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every customer that walked in made me flinch. I started having panic attacks before my shifts, but I needed the job. I couldn't afford to quit. Then came that awful night. I was closing up alone. My coworker had called in sick. As I was locking the door, I saw him, standing across the street staring at me. My blood ran cold. I quickly got in my car, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled out of the lot, I saw headlights behind me. It was him, following me. I took random turns, trying to lose him, but he stayed on my tail. Tears were streaming down my face as I realized he knew where I lived. He was going to follow me home. In desperation, I pulled into a gas station, hoping there'd be other people around. But at nearly midnight, the place was deserted. I sat there, engine idling, as he pulled up beside me. He got out of his car, that sickeningly familiar grin on his face. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out. "Awfully late to be out alone. Why don't you let me give you a ride home?" I was frozen in terror. This was it. He was going to drag me out of the car, do God knows what to me. No one would hear me scream. Then I remembered the knife. A small paring knife I kept in my glove box for emergencies. With trembling fingers, I grabbed it and threw open my door. "Stay back," I screamed, brandishing the blade. "I swear to God I'll use it." He looked shocked, like he couldn't believe his prey was fighting back. For a long moment we just stared at each other, me shaking and sobbing, desperately clutching that tiny knife. Him, eyes darting between my face and the blade. Finally, he backed away, hands raised. "Whoa, easy there, no need to get crazy." He retreated to his car. "Psycho bitch," I heard him mutter as he drove off. I collapsed back into my seat, the knife clattering to the pavement. I sat there for what felt like hours, struggling to breathe, before I felt safe enough to drive home. The next day, I quit my job. I couldn't bear the thought of ever seeing him again. I was too ashamed and scared to go to the police. What if they didn't believe me? What if it made him angry? I moved to a new city, got a new job, but the trauma lingers. I'm always looking over my shoulder, flinching at shadows. I keep that knife with me everywhere I go now. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted, if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the cold look in his eyes that night, the way he sneered at me. I know in my bones that if I hadn't had that knife, something terrible would have happened. I don't know why he fixated on me, or why he suddenly stopped. To this day, I'm terrified I'll turn a corner and see him there, waiting, watching, ready to finish what he started. So I stay vigilant. I take self-defense classes. I vary my routines. I never close up anywhere alone. Because I know there are monsters out there, monsters who look just like everyone else. And next time, I'll be ready. A few days later, I got the call that I was hired. The manager, a gruff middle-aged guy named Tom, told me to come in that night at 11 p.m. for training. When I arrived, the place was eerily quiet. Most of the dining area was still blocked off with plastic sheeting, and half the kitchen equipment was missing. Tom gave me a quick tour, showing me where everything was and running through basic procedures. "We're not open to the public yet," he explained. "But corporate wants us to start getting the kitchen back up and running. You'll be helping prep ingredients, cleaning and testing equipment to make sure everything's working right before we reopen next month." It was boring work, but easy enough. For the first few nights it was just me and Tom working the overnight shift. But as we got closer to the reopening date, they brought on a few more people, a quiet guy named Mike and two chatty college girls, Amber and Jess. That's when things started getting weird. It was about a week before the grand reopening. We were all there that night. Me, Tom, Mike, Amber, and Jess. Around 2 a.m. I was in the back prepping lettuce when I heard it. 2 loud, distinct knocks coming from the dining area. I froze, knife in hand, straining my ears. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Knock, knock. I set down the knife and poked my head out of the kitchen. "Did you guys hear that?" I called out. Amber stuck her head around the corner from where she'd been mopping. "Yeah, what was that?" We all converged near the counter, peering out into the dimly lit dining room. Most of it was still sectioned off with plastic sheeting, creating strange shadows in the low light. "Probably just settling noises," Tom said gruffly. "Old building and all that. Get back to work." We reluctantly dispersed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Those knocks had sounded so deliberate, so purposeful. An hour later, it happened again. This time, the knocks came from a different part of the dining room, over by the blocked-off play area. Knock, knock. "Okay, that's not settling noises," Jess said, her eyes wide. Tom frowned and grabbed a flashlight. "I'll go check it out. You all stay here." We watched as he ducked under the plastic sheeting and swept his flashlight beam around the empty dining room. After a few tense minutes, he came back. "Nothing there," he reported. "No open windows, no signs of any animals or anything that could be making that noise. Let's just try to ignore it and get our work done." But it was hard to ignore. The knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, always two distinct knocks, always from different areas of the dining room. By the time our shift ended at 7 a.m., we were all on edge. "Maybe it's just pipes or something," Amber suggested as we were leaving. "Old plumbing acting up?" "Yeah, maybe," I said, not believing it for a second. The next night was quiet, no knocking at all. I started to think maybe it had just been a fluke, some weird one-off thing. But then came the night that changed everything. It was about 3 a.m. I was taking my break in the staff room when Jess burst in, white as a sheet. "Gee, guys," she stammered. "I just saw something in the hallway." We all crowded around her. "What do you mean?" Tom demanded. "What did you see?" Jess took a shaky breath. It looked like a person, but not quite. It was like colorless, like a black and white photo come to life, and it just disappeared around the corner." Mike scoffed. "Come on, you're seeing things. Probably just shadows from the construction stuff." But Jess was adamant. "No, I know what I saw. It was right there, clear as day, and then it was gone." Tom sighed heavily. "All right, let's all just calm down. Jess, you've been working hard. You're probably just tired. Why don't you take an extra 15 minutes on your break? The rest of you, back to work." We tried to go about our tasks, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Everyone kept glancing over their shoulders, jumping at small noises, and then it happened. I was restocking napkins when I heard Amber scream from the kitchen. We all came running to find her backed up against the wall, shaking and pointing at the walk-in freezer. "It's in there!" she cried. That thing Jess saw. It's in the freezer!" Tom cursed under his breath and strode over to the freezer door. He yanked it open, revealing nothing, just shelves of frozen food. "There's nothing in here," he said, exasperated. "You're all letting your imaginations run wild. Now I don't want to hear any more about ghosts or whatever you think you're seeing. We have work to do." But it was useless. The rest of the night was a lost cause. No one could focus, and we all kept seeing things out of the corners of our eyes. Fleeting shadows, glimpses of that colorless figure. The knocking started up again too, more insistent than ever. By the time our shift ended, we were all thoroughly freaked out. As we hurried out to our cars, Jess turned to me with wide eyes. "I'm not coming back," she said. "I don't care if I get fired. This place is wrong." I nodded, understanding completely. But I knew I'd be back the next night. I needed this job too badly to quit. The next few nights were quieter, but the atmosphere remained tense. Mike stopped showing up, and Tom had to scramble to find a replacement. Jess was true to her word and never came back either. It was 5 days before the reopening when things escalated again. I was alone in the kitchen, prepping burger patties, when I heard it, a long, low moan coming from the dining room. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard either. It was just wrong. I dropped the spatula I was holding and ran to find Tom. He was in the office going over some paperwork. "Did you hear that?" I gasped. He looked up, annoyed. "Hear what?" That sound from the dining room, like a moan or something." Tom's face darkened. "I didn't hear anything, and I thought I told you all to knock it off with this ghost nonsense. But no buts. Get back to work." I turned to leave, but then I heard it again, louder this time, and definitely coming from the dining room. Tom heard it too. I saw his face go pale. Without a word, we both ran out to the dining area. The plastic sheeting was swaying gently, as if disturbed by a breeze, but there were no open windows, no fans running. And then we saw it, just for a moment, illuminated by the emergency exit sign, a figure standing in the corner, colorless, just like Jess had described. It seemed to flicker like an old film reel, and then it was gone. Tom and I stood there in stunned silence for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lock up. We're leaving. Now." We didn't even bother cleaning up. We just grabbed our things and got out of there as fast as we could. As I was rushing to my car, I could have sworn I heard those 2 familiar knocks coming from inside the empty restaurant. Knock, knock. The next day, Tom called us all to tell us the reopening was being postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. I later heard through the grapevine that corporate had decided to scrap the whole project and sell the building. I don't know what was going on in that place. I don't know if it was truly haunted or if there was some other explanation for what we all experienced. All I know is that to this day, years later, I still have nightmares about that colorless figure and those 2 insistent knocks. Knock, knock. Maybe it was because the building used to be a morgue back in the day. Not just any morgue either. It's where they brought the bodies after executions at the state prison. I tried not to think about it too much, but on quiet nights when the place was empty, it was hard not to let your mind wander. That particular night, it was just me and my co-worker Jake closing up. We had finished cleaning the last theater and were doing our final walkthrough of the building before locking up. Everything seemed normal at first. Lobby clear, concession stand wiped down, bathrooms empty. We were about to head out when we both froze. There was a slow, drawn-out creaking sound coming from down the hall. It sounded exactly like one of the old bathroom stall doors opening, but we had just checked, and there was definitely no one in there. Jake and I looked at each other, eyes wide. "You heard that too, right?" I whispered. He nodded, face pale. Against my better judgment, we decided to go check it out. My heart was pounding as we crept down the darkened hallway towards the bathrooms. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead. When we reached the women's restroom door, we hesitated. The creaking had stopped, but there was a palpable heaviness in the air. Jake reached out and slowly pushed the door open. Empty. Not a soul in sight. We checked every stall, looked behind the trash cans, even peeked under the sinks. Nothing. Maybe it was just the building settling, Jake said weakly, but we both knew that wasn't it. That sound had been unmistakable. As we backed out of the bathroom, the lights suddenly went out. Just for a second. plunging us into total darkness before flickering back on. In that brief moment, I swear I saw a dark figure standing at the end of the hall. But when the lights came back, there was nothing there. We practically ran out of the building after that, locking up in record time. I tried to convince myself it was just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right about that place. The weird occurrences only escalated from there. A few nights later, I was closing up alone. I had just finished my rounds and was heading to clock out when I heard what sounded like whispers coming from Theater 3. My first thought was that some kids had snuck in and were hiding out. It had happened before, so I reluctantly went to check, flashlight in hand. The theater was pitch black as I entered. I swept my light across the rows of seats, seeing nothing out of place, but the whispering continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out any words, just a constant, unsettling murmur. "Hello?" I called out, voice shaking. "Anyone in here? The theater's closed. You need to leave." The whispering abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the back corner of the theater, I heard a single distinct laugh. It was unlike any laugh I'd ever heard, hollow and mirthless, sending chills down my spine. I booked it out of there as fast as my legs could carry me. I seriously considered quitting right then and there, but I needed the job, and I managed to convince myself I was just stressed and hearing things. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts, because things only got stranger from there. About a week later, Jake and I were closing together again. We had just finished cleaning the last theater and were heading to the supply closet to put away the cleaning supplies. As we approached, we both stopped short. The closet door was wide open, light spilling out into the hallway. I distinctly remembered closing and locking it earlier that night. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you open this?" I asked. He shook his head. Cautiously, we peered inside. At first glance, everything looked normal, but then I noticed something odd about the mop bucket in the corner. It was full of water, dark, murky water that seemed to be gently rippling, as if something was moving beneath the surface. As we watched, transfixed, a pale hand slowly emerged from the water, reaching upwards. It was unlike any hand I'd ever seen, bloated and discolored, with long, talon-like fingernails. We slammed the door shut and ran. We didn't even bother finishing closing procedures, just grabbed our things and got the hell out of there. The next day, I went to the manager and told him what had been happening. To my surprise, he didn't seem shocked. He sighed heavily and told me that strange occurrences had been reported in the building for years, ever since it was converted from the old morgue. "We try not to talk about it," he said. "Bad for business, you know. But yeah, weird stuff happens sometimes, especially during closing when it's quiet." He went on to tell me that years ago, when they were first renovating the building, construction kept getting delayed by inexplicable accidents. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in bizarre places. Workers reported feeling like they were being watched or hearing whispers when no one was around. One night, a worker who was pulling an overnight shift supposedly saw a group of ghostly figures walking in a line through the unfinished lobby, as if being led to their execution. He quit on the spot and refused to ever set foot in the building again. The manager assured me that nothing truly dangerous had ever happened, and that most of the staff learned to just ignore the occasional weird occurrence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were treading on ground where we didn't belong. Despite my misgivings, I kept working there. The pay was decent, and I figured I could handle a few spooky incidents. But things came to a head about a month later. I was doing the final security check before closing making sure all the exit doors were locked. As I approached the emergency exit by Theater 6, I noticed it was slightly ajar. Odd, since I was sure I had locked it earlier. I pushed it open, intending to check outside and make sure no one had snuck in. But as soon as I stepped through the doorway, everything changed. Instead of the parking lot, I found myself in what looked like an old-fashioned morgue. The walls were tiled, and there were several metal examination tables, some with sheet-covered bodies on them. The air was heavy with the smell of chemicals and decay. I stumbled backwards in shock, my back hitting the door, but the door was gone. In its place was just more tiled wall. I was trapped. Panic rising in my throat, I looked around wildly for a way out. That's when I noticed the figures standing silently around the edges of the room. They were hazy and indistinct, like heat shimmer given form, but I could make out enough to see that they were dressed in old-fashioned prison uniforms. One of the figures stepped forward. As it got closer, its features became clearer. It was a man, probably in his 40s, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. There was a faint red mark around his neck, like a rope burn. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, anger, fear, regret, and a deep, aching sadness. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. The other figures started moving closer, each one radiating its own mix of intense emotions. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, everything shifted again. Suddenly, I was back in the hallway of the cinema, gasping for air and drenched in sweat. The emergency exit door was closed and locked, as if nothing had happened. I quit the next day. No job was worth going through something like that again. The manager tried to convince me to stay, saying it was probably just stress causing me to hallucinate. But I knew what I had experienced was real. I've tried to research the history of that building since then, to make sense of what happened. I found out that over 200 people were executed at the old state prison, their bodies processed through that morgue. Many were likely innocent, victims of a flawed justice system. Sometimes I wonder if by building that cinema, we disturbed something that should have been left to rest. Those spirits, or whatever they were, seemed like they had a message they desperately wanted to convey. But maybe some stories are better left untold. All I know is I'll never set foot in that cinema again, and whenever I pass by, I say a silent prayer for those lost souls, hoping they've finally found peace. That night started out normal enough. I was restocking the coolers when the phone rang. Figuring it was probably corporate calling about inventory or something, I picked up with my usual cheerful, "Thank you for calling Gas and Go. This is Amy speaking. How can I help you?" There was a pause, then a man's voice came on the line. "Hey, sweetheart, what are you wearing right now?" I rolled my eyes, used to dealing with drunk idiots and prank callers. "Sir, this is a place of business. If you're not calling about gas or convenience store items, I'm going to have to end this call." "Aw, come on, baby. Don't be like that," the voice continued, taking on a creepy, wheedling tone. "I bet you look real pretty in that uniform. Why don't you tell me what color panties you've got on under there?" Disgusted, I hung up without another word. Perverts like that weren't worth engaging with. I tried to put it out of my mind and went back to my tasks, but I felt unsettled. Something about his voice had sent a chill down my spine. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Gas and Go, how can I help you?" It was him again. "You shouldn't have hung up on me. That wasn't very nice." His voice had taken on a menacing edge. "I know you're all alone in there. Maybe I should come pay you a visit, teach you some manners." My heart started racing. "I'm calling the police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I slammed the phone down and immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher was sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do about threatening phone calls. They'd send a patrol car to drive by, but that was about it. I hung up feeling frustrated and scared. For the next couple hours, the creep kept calling every 15-20 minutes. Sometimes he'd whisper dirty things. Other times he'd describe violent acts he wanted to do to me. I stopped answering after the first few, but the constant ringing had me on edge. Around 4 a.m., I was wiping down the counter when movement outside caught my eye. A beat-up Chevy truck had pulled into the lot, but instead of coming to the pumps, it was idling near the edge of the property. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but something told me it was him. My hands shaking, I grabbed my phone to call 911 again. Before I could dial, the truck's headlights flicked on, illuminating the store interior. I ducked down behind the counter, my heart pounding. For what felt like an eternity, I crouched there in terror as the truck slowly circled the lot. Finally, the engine revved, and I heard it pull away. I waited a few more minutes before cautiously peeking out. The lot was empty. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every little noise, convinced he'd come back. When my replacement showed up at 6 a.m., I practically ran to my car. I filed a report with my boss and the police, but without a plate number or clear description, there wasn't much they could do. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to relax a little. Maybe it had just been some sick one-time thing. But exactly a week later, the calls started again. Same voice, same perverted comments and threats. This time he seemed angry that I'd tried to get the cops involved. "Thought you could hide behind your pig friends, huh?" he snarled. "I know your schedule now. I know when you're alone, and sweetheart, you will be sorry." I hung up and called my boss, begging to be taken off night shifts. He was sympathetic, but said he couldn't change the whole schedule for one prank caller. I thought about quitting, but I really needed this job. The next night, I brought a small canister of pepper spray and a knife, just in case. I kept the knife hidden under the counter where I could grab it quickly. The calls came like clockwork, about every 20 minutes, each one more graphic and threatening than the last. Around 3 a.m., I saw the truck pull in again. This time it came right up to the store. I gripped the knife with sweaty palms as a man got out and approached the door. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. He was average height and build, probably in his 40s, with thinning hair and a pot belly. He didn't look particularly threatening, but the leer on his face made my skin crawl. As soon as he stepped inside, I knew it was him. I recognized the voice immediately when he spoke. "Well, hello there, sweetheart. Thought it was about time we met face to face." I raised the knife, pointing it at him with a shaking hand. "Get out, now. I've called the police." He chuckled, seemingly unfazed by the blade. "No, you haven't. Your phone's been awful quiet. Now why don't you put that down before you hurt yourself?" He took a step closer, and I saw the glint of metal in his hand. He had a knife too, and a much bigger one than mine. Panic surged through me. I knew I was no match for him physically. In that moment, some primal instinct took over. I vaulted over the counter and charged at him, screaming at the top of my lungs. The sudden movement caught him off guard. Before he could react, I slashed wildly with my knife. I caught him across the forearm, and he yelped in pain, dropping his own blade. Taking advantage of his shock, I kept coming at him, swinging the knife and shrieking like a banshee. He backpedaled rapidly, eyes wide with fear now. "Crazy bitch," he yelled as he practically fell out the door. I chased him into the parking lot, still screaming and brandishing the bloody knife. He scrambled into his truck and peeled out of there, tires squealing. I stood there trembling as the adrenaline slowly faded, half expecting him to come back. But the night remained quiet. When my replacement arrived, I was still clutching the knife, unable to fully process what had happened. I quit on the spot, leaving the blood-smeared blade on the counter as evidence. The police investigated, but the creep was never caught. Sometimes I still have nightmares about his voice on the phone. But mostly, I'm proud that when pushed to my limit, I found the strength to fight back. I may have been the prey that night, but in the end, I became the predator. I usually enjoyed the quiet of the night shift. The hotel would be mostly empty, just a few guests here and there. I'd do my rounds, make sure everything was secure, maybe chat with the occasional insomniac guest getting ice or heading out for a late-night smoke. But that night in early October felt different from the start. There was a chill in the air that seemed to seep right into my bones. The wind was howling something fierce, rattling the old windows. I remember thinking it sounded almost like voices moaning. I was halfway through my 11 p.m. rounds when I saw him for the first time. I had just come down the main staircase to the lobby when movement caught my eye. A man in an impeccable 1920s-style suit was striding purposefully across the lobby towards the staff-only door that led to the kitchens. My first thought was that it must be a guest who had gotten turned around looking for the restroom. "Excuse me, sir," I called out. "That area is off-limits to guests." But he didn't even pause. He went right through the door like he hadn't heard me at all. Irritated, I hurried after him. Guest or not, I couldn't let someone wander around in restricted areas. I pushed through the door just seconds after him, but the hallway beyond was empty. I frowned, confused. There were no side doors he could have ducked into, nowhere he could have gone in those few seconds. I walked quickly down the hall, checking each door, but found nothing. Unsettled, I finished my rounds and tried to shake off the odd encounter, but I couldn't get the image of that man out of my head. His perfectly pressed suit, his confident stride. He had seemed so real, so solid. Where could he have gone? A few hours later, around 2 a.m., I was in the business center printing out some reports when movement outside the window caught my eye. I looked up, and there he was again, the same man in the vintage suit, strolling casually across the back lawn towards the old family cemetery. My heart started racing. How had he gotten outside? I hadn't seen anyone leave through the lobby. And why was he heading for the cemetery in the middle of the night? I hurried outside, determined to catch up to him this time. The wind had died down, but there was a heavy fog rolling in from the ocean. I could just make out his silhouette moving between the weathered headstones. "Hey!" I called out. "Sir, you can't be out here." He kept walking, moving deeper into the cemetery. I followed, my shoes squelching in the damp grass. The fog was getting thicker by the second. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Suddenly, the man's figure vanished. 1 second he was there, the next, gone. I spun in a circle, peering into the mist, but there was no sign of him. An icy tendril of fear crept up my spine. I stumbled back towards the hotel, my mind racing. Who was this man? How did he keep disappearing? Was I losing it? When I got back inside, I went straight to the computer and started researching the hotel's history. There had to be some explanation. That's when I found it, an old black and white photo from 1925. It showed a group of people gathered for a funeral in the cemetery, and there, clear as day, was the man I'd been chasing. Same suit, same face. The caption identified him as Edward Blackwood, the hotel's original owner. Edward Blackwood, who had died in 1925. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I had seen a ghost. Or maybe not even a ghost, but some kind of replay of the past. Like the hotel was stuck in a time loop, showing me glimpses of events from nearly a century ago. I made it through the rest of my shift in a daze. When the morning staff arrived, I mumbled some excuse and practically ran out of there. I spent the whole day researching, trying to make sense of what had happened. I learned that Star Island had a reputation for strange occurrences. There were old legends about time behaving oddly there, about people seeing things that couldn't be explained. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I'd quit, find another job. But when my next shift came around, I found myself driving out to the island again. I had to know if it would happen again. I had to understand. But that night was quiet. No ghostly figures, no impossible disappearances. Just the normal creaks and groans of an old building. I've worked dozens of night shifts since then. I've never seen the man in the suit again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I look at that old photo, at Edward Blackwood's face, and I know what I saw was real. I don't know if it was a ghost or some kind of time slip. I don't know why it happened that night and never again. But I do know that there are things in this world that can't be easily explained. The Oceanic Hotel holds secrets, echoes of the past that sometimes bleed through into the present. I still work the night shift. And every time I make my rounds, every time I pass that staff door or look out towards the cemetery, I find myself holding my breath, wondering if tonight will be the night I see him again, wondering what other glimpses of the past might be waiting to reveal themselves in the shadows of this old hotel. That night started out pretty normal. It was a Tuesday, so things were slow. I spent most of the evening restocking shelves and watching the clock, counting down the hours until I could go home and crash. Around 2 a.m., I decided to head down to the basement to grab some more inventory. As soon as I opened that creaky old door to the basement, I felt a chill run down my spine. The fluorescent lights flickered as I flipped the switch, casting an eerie glow over the dusty shelves and boxes. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I made my way down the rickety wooden stairs. I was about halfway down when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming up behind me. My heart started racing as I whirled around, but there was no one there, just the empty staircase stretching up into the dimly lit store above. I stood frozen for a moment, straining my ears. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. No response. I tried to convince myself it was just the old building settling or my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I turned back to continue down the stairs, the footsteps started up again. Closer this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I felt a presence right behind me. I bolted down the rest of the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste to get away from whatever was following me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the box I needed off the shelf. I didn't want to turn around, terrified of what I might see. As I steeled myself to head back up, I felt it, an icy touch on my shoulder, like bony fingers grasping me. I screamed and dropped the box, items clattering across the floor as I sprinted for the stairs. I took them two at a time, the phantom footsteps echoing behind me the whole way up. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It had felt so real, but it couldn't be. There was no one down there with me, right? I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every little noise, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When my coworker Jake showed up to take over at 6 a.m., I practically ran out the door, but I couldn't just forget about it. The next night, I reluctantly returned for my shift. Everything seemed normal at first, and I started to think maybe I had just been overtired and imagining things. Around midnight, I was organizing the magazine rack when I heard a loud crash from the back room. My stomach dropped as I cautiously went to investigate. The storage shelves had collapsed, scattering products everywhere. As I surveyed the mess, movement caught my eye. A box slowly slid off a shelf all on its own and crashed to the floor. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. But before I could even process it, the light started flickering wildly. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath in the suddenly frigid air. And then I heard the whispering. Faint at first, but growing louder. I couldn't make out any words, just an unsettling chorus of disembodied voices. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran back out to the front, frantically looking around for any sign of what was causing this. The whispers followed me, growing more frenzied. The lights continued to flicker and items started falling off shelves. It was like the whole store had come alive. I cowered behind the counter, too terrified to move. This went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. And then, as suddenly as it started, everything went silent and still. The light stabilized and the temperature returned to normal. I sat there shaking for a long time, afraid it would start up again if I moved. When nothing else happened, I slowly stood up on wobbly legs. The store looked completely normal, like nothing had happened. If it weren't for the mess in the back room, I might have thought I was losing my mind. I seriously considered just walking out and never coming back. But I needed this job, and I was afraid of what my boss would think if I just abandoned my shift. So I spent the rest of the night in a state of constant anxiety, flinching at every little sound. When Jake arrived in the morning, I practically pounced on him. "Jake, has anything weird ever happened to you here at night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave me a knowing look. "Oh yeah, this place is haunted as hell. Didn't anyone warn you?" I stared at him in disbelief. "What? No. What do you mean it's haunted?" Jake shrugged casually, like we were discussing the weather. "Yeah, apparently this building is super old. Used to be a funeral home back in the day. Lots of creepy shit goes down here at night. That's why no one wants the overnight shift." I felt a mix of relief that I wasn't crazy and anger that no one had told me. "Why didn't anyone say anything? I've been terrified." "Sorry, thought you knew. Most people figure it out pretty quick and quit. I'm surprised you've lasted this long, honestly." I shook my head, still processing this information. "What kind of things happen? Have you seen anything?" Jake's eyes widened. "Oh man, where do I even start? I've heard voices, seen shadows moving on their own, had stuff thrown at me. One time I swear I saw a full-on apparition by the coolers, scared the shit out of me." He went on to describe other incidents, inexplicable cold spots, electronics malfunctioning, the feeling of being watched or touched. It all sounded so similar to what I'd experienced. "How can you keep working here knowing all that?" I asked incredulously. He shrugged again. "You get used to it after a while. They don't seem to mean any harm, just like messing with us, I think. Plus, the pay is good for night shift." I couldn't believe how nonchalant he was being about all this. There was no way I could just get used to being terrorized by ghosts every night. "Well, I'm out," I declared. "You can tell the boss I quit. No job is worth this." Jake nodded understandingly. "Can't blame you. Good luck finding something else." I gathered my things and left, vowing never to set foot in that store again. In the weeks since, I've replayed those experiences over and over in my mind. Part of me still wants to believe there's some logical explanation, but deep down, I know what I saw and felt was real. I've done some research since then and found out more about the building's history as a funeral home. Apparently, it was in operation for over 50 years before being converted to a store. Who knows how many restless spirits might still be lingering there. I'm just glad to be out of there, but I still get chills every time I drive past that store. To anyone working night shift in an old building, be prepared. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. My first few nights were uneventful. The massive building was eerily quiet as I made my rounds, flashlight in hand. The abandoned machinery cast strange shadows in the dim emergency lighting, but nothing too out of the ordinary. It was during my second week that things started to get weird. I was doing my usual 2 a.m. walkthrough when I heard what sounded like muffled voices coming from the far end of the building. My first thought was intruders, so I radioed it in and cautiously made my way toward the sound. As I got closer, I could make out bits and pieces of conversation, but it sounded off somehow. The cadence was strange, almost like an old-timey radio broadcast. When I rounded the corner to the area where the voices seemed to be coming from, they abruptly stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I swept my flashlight beam across the empty room. No sign of anyone. I chalked it up to my imagination and lack of sleep. But over the next few nights I kept hearing those damn voices. Always indistinct, always seeming to come from just around the corner or behind a closed door, and always vanishing the moment I got close. I started dreading my shifts. The voices were bad enough, but now other weird stuff was happening too. Doors I knew I'd left open would be closed when I came back around, or vice versa. One night I distinctly heard footsteps above me on the catwalk, but when I went to investigate, there was no one there. I considered quitting, but I really needed the money. So I started asking around, trying to find out if anyone else had experienced anything strange at the warehouse. That's when I learned about its history. Turns out the building dated back to the Civil War era. It had originally been a textile mill, then was converted to a military hospital during the war. Hundreds of soldiers had died there. After the war, it became a carpet factory, operating for nearly a century before shutting down in the 90s. But the creepiest part, the whole area had been the site of a major battle. They'd basically built the factory on top of a mass grave. Suddenly, all the weird occurrences started to make a sick kind of sense. Armed with this knowledge, I went into my next shift with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. Would knowing the building's history make things better or worse? I got my answer around midnight. I was in the break room having some coffee when I heard a loud bang from the main floor. I ran out to investigate and saw that the heavy fire door at the end of the corridor had slammed shut. As I approached to check it out, it slowly creaked open again. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my flashlight to examine the door. There was no wind, no draft that could have caused it to move like that, and it was way too heavy to just swing open and closed on its own. As I was standing there, puzzling over the door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A small, dark figure darted across the hallway about 50 feet away. It was only in view for a split second, but in that moment I could have sworn it was only about 3 feet tall and seemed to be floating slightly above the ground. I called out, thinking maybe it was a kid who had snuck in somehow, but there was no response. I walked quickly to where I'd seen the figure, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, no sign anyone had passed through. I spent the next hour meticulously searching that entire section of the warehouse. Every room, every closet, behind every stack of crates. Nothing. I was starting to question my own sanity at this point. Exhausted and on edge, I decided to head back to the security office to review the camera footage. Maybe I'd see something that would explain what I'd witnessed. As I was walking down the long corridor to the office, I heard what sounded like a child giggling behind me. I whirled around, but the hallway was empty. Then I heard it again, this time from in front of me. I spun back around, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls. Still nothing. The giggling grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once. I broke into a run, desperate to reach the relative safety of the office. Just as I got to the door, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down and saw nothing. But I could have sworn I felt small, cold fingers grab at my pant leg for just an instant. I practically dove into the office, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the lock. I slumped into the chair, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. After a few minutes, I pulled up the security camera feeds. With trembling fingers, I rewound to the time when I'd seen the small figure in the hallway. I leaned in close, watching intently as my past self came into frame, examining the door, and then I saw it. Clear as day on the grainy black and white footage, a small, dark shape moving across the hallway. It was blurry, but unmistakably there. I froze the frame and zoomed in as much as I could. What I saw made my blood run cold. It looked like a child, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, the limbs too long and thin, and its face, where its face should have been, was just a black void. I sat there staring at that terrible image, my mind reeling. This was proof that I wasn't going crazy, that what I'd seen was real. But somehow that was even more terrifying than thinking I'd imagined it all. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of paranoia and dread. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak and groan of the old building sounded like footsteps or whispered voices. I didn't dare leave the office again. When 6 a.m. finally rolled around, I practically sprinted to my car. I called my boss as soon as I got home and quit on the spot. No job was worth going through another night like that. It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about that place. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that child's giggle echoing in the darkness. I've tried to research the history of the factory, to find some explanation for what I experienced, but I've never found anything conclusive. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of old buildings with dark histories. And if you're not careful, you might just come face to face with them in the dead of night, when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from my time at that warehouse. But I do know one thing for certain. You couldn't pay me enough to step foot in that place again. Some doors are better left unopened, some mysteries better left unsolved. And some jobs, well, some jobs just aren't worth the risk. I headed out to the empty parking lot for a much-needed cigarette. The cool night air felt refreshing after being cooped up inside all night. I leaned against the wall of the building, savoring that first drag. The parking lot was brightly lit by tall lampposts, creating pools of harsh white light amid the darkness. A few cars were scattered around, my beat-up Honda Civic, my co-worker Dave's pickup truck, and a couple others I didn't recognize. At first, everything seemed normal. I could hear the faint hum of the building's AC units and the occasional car passing by on the nearby highway. A plane droned overhead, but as I stood there smoking, I started to notice something odd. The ambient noise seemed to be fading away, like someone was slowly turning down the volume on the world around me. Within the span of about 30 seconds, it went from normal nighttime sounds to complete and utter silence. I'm talking dead silence, the kind you only experience in a soundproof room. I couldn't even hear myself breathing. It was so sudden and absolute that it felt suffocating, like all the air had been sucked out of the atmosphere. I looked around, confused and a little freaked out. Everything looked the same, but it felt wrong. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I took another drag of my cigarette, watching the smoke curl upwards in the still air. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, clear as day, the unmistakable sound of shoes on pavement. But there was no one there. I scanned the parking lot, squinting into the shadows between the lamp posts, but I was completely alone. Yet the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. They sounded like they were coming from the far end of the lot, near the entrance. As I listened, frozen in place, they seemed to be getting closer. The steady rhythm of heel-toe echoed in the unnatural silence. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the dead air. No response, just those phantom footsteps getting nearer. I pushed off from the wall, turning in a slow circle as I tried to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. But it seemed to shift. 1 second it sounded like it was coming from my left, the next from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just empty pavement stretching out in all directions. The cigarette slipped from my fingers as I backed up against the wall. I could hear the footsteps clearly now, as if whoever or whatever was making them was only yards away. But the lot remained empty. I screwed my eyes shut, telling myself I was imagining things. When I opened them again, I half expected to see a person standing in front of me. But there was nothing. I fumbled for my keycard, my hands shaking as I swiped it through the reader by the door. It beeped and flashed green, and I practically fell inside in my haste to get back into the building. As soon as the door clicked shut behind me, the normal sounds of the office rushed back in, the hum of computers, the faint murmur of my coworkers on calls. I leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Had I imagined the whole thing? I peered out the small window in the door. The parking lot looked completely ordinary. No mysterious figures, no signs of anything unusual. Just a typical night. I made my way back to my desk on shaky legs, ignoring the concerned look Dave shot me from his cubicle. I tried to focus on work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing towards the exit, half expecting to see something there. The rest of my shift crawled by. When 7 a.m. finally rolled around, I practically ran to my car. The parking lot was bustling with day shift employees arriving, completely normal in the pale morning light. But as I drove home, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the night in my head. I've racked my brain trying to come up with a logical explanation for what happened. Maybe I dozed off for a few seconds while smoking and had some kind of waking dream. Or perhaps it was an auditory hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and too much caffeine. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. It's been 3 weeks since that night. I requested a transfer to day shift, claiming the night hours were messing with my sleep schedule. My boss was understanding and approved the switch. I tell myself it's just because I prefer working during the day. But if I'm being honest, I don't think I could handle being in that parking lot at night again. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I think I hear those phantom footsteps again, echoing in the distance. I lie there with my eyes squeezed shut, heart racing, until the sound fades away. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, but one thing's for sure. I'll never look at an empty parking lot the same way again. I've debated posting about this for a while, wondering if anyone else has experienced something similar. Part of me hopes someone has an explanation that will put my mind at ease. But another part of me is terrified of finding out I'm not alone in this. Either way, I needed to get this off my chest. Thanks for reading, and if you ever find yourself alone in a parking lot late at night, maybe think twice before stepping outside for a smoke. That night started off like any other. I arrived around 10 p.m., unlocked the rusty side door, and flicked on the dim fluorescent lights that barely illuminated the cavernous main gym area. The squeaking of my mop bucket echoed off the high ceilings as I made my way through my usual cleaning routine. Around midnight, I was in the locker room when I heard a loud banging noise coming from the front of the building. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind rattling one of the old metal doors, but then I heard it again, a deliberate, forceful pounding. My heart started racing as I crept out to investigate. As I peered around the corner into the lobby, I saw a dark figure silhouetted against the glass doors, violently smashing something against the reinforced security windows. The sound was deafening in the empty building. I ducked back, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands to call 911. Just as the operator answered, I heard the sickening crack of breaking glass. Oh God, he was getting in. I whispered frantically to the dispatcher, telling them where I was and begging them to send help fast. She assured me police were on the way, but it felt like an eternity as I cowered in the darkened hallway. Heavy footsteps echoed through the lobby. A gruff voice called out, "I know you're in here, come out now." I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall and praying he wouldn't find me. The beam of a flashlight swept across the floor nearby. He was getting closer. Suddenly, the intruder let out a bellow of rage and started smashing things. I could hear glass shattering, metal clanging, wood splintering. "Where are you?" he roared. "I'll find you. You can't hide forever." I was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. This was it. He was going to kill me. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to make myself as small as possible. The sound of his heavy boots grew louder. He was right around the corner now. I could hear his ragged breathing, smell cigarette smoke and alcohol. This was it. Just then, a burst of red and blue flashing lights illuminated the lobby. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" Relief flooded through me as I heard multiple officers storming in. There was a scuffle and shouting, then the clinking of handcuffs. As they led the intruder out, I finally got a look at him. A huge, wild-eyed man with a shaved head and face covered in tattoos. He locked eyes with me and snarled, "This isn't over." I shuddered. The police took my statement and assured me he'd be locked up for a long time. They said he was high on meth and had been on a crime spree all night. If they hadn't arrived when they did, I don't even want to think about what might have happened. I quit that job the next day. No amount of money was worth going through something like that again. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about that night. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, imagining I could hear glass breaking and heavy footsteps coming for me in the dark. Even now, years later, I still get anxious in big empty buildings. The sound of breaking glass makes me jump. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear echoes of that man's enraged voice. I know it's all in my head, but the fear feels so real. I'll never forget the sheer terror of hiding in that dark hallway, knowing a violent intruder was hunting for me. It was the longest, most horrifying night of my life. I'm just grateful I made it out alive. As I grabbed the cleaning supplies, Mike called out, "Hey, don't forget to turn off the music in there before you start." I nodded, heading towards the play area. The cheerful kids' songs that usually blared from the speakers during the day were still playing softly, creating an eerie contrast with the darkened, empty playground. I stepped inside and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. Something felt off. The colorful plastic structures loomed ominously in the dim light, casting strange shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to late-night jitters. As I reached for the control panel to shut off the music, it suddenly cut out on its own. I froze, my hand still outstretched. That was weird. The music was on a timer and shouldn't have stopped for another hour. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A child's giggle. I whirled around, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The playground was empty. I peered into every nook and cranny, but there was no sign of a child. I must have imagined it, I told myself. Just my tired brain playing tricks on me. I was about to call out to Mike when I heard it again, a high-pitched laugh echoing through the plastic tubes. It sounded like it was coming from inside the twisty slide. "Mike!" I yelled, backing away from the playground equipment. "Mike, get in here!" I heard his footsteps rushing towards me. "What's wrong?" he asked, bursting through the door. I heard something," I stammered. "A kid laughing, but there's no one here." Mike's face paled. "That's impossible. I locked the doors an hour ago." We stood there in tense silence, straining our ears. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of our breathing. Then it came again, a child's laughter, clear as day. But this time, it didn't stop. The giggles grew louder, echoing off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Mike and I exchanged terrified glances. This couldn't be happening. Suddenly, the laughter changed. It morphed into something else, a child crying. Heart-wrenching sobs filled the air, growing more and more distressed. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, grabbing my arm. But as we turned to leave, the crying transformed once again. A blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It was the most horrifying sound I've ever heard, a child in absolute agony and terror. The scream went on and on, growing impossibly loud until it felt like my eardrums would burst. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, Mike and I just stood there, frozen in shock. Then the music kicked back on, blasting at full volume and making us both jump out of our skins. We bolted out of there so fast, I'm surprised we didn't leave scorch marks on the floor. Mike slammed the door behind us, and we stood in the main part of the restaurant, panting and wide-eyed. "What the hell was that?" I gasped. Mike shook his head, his face ashen. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. Let's just finish closing up and get out of here." We moved through the rest of our closing duties in a daze, jumping at every little sound. The events in the playground kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the memory of that scream. It felt like it was etched into my brain. As we were about to leave, Mike paused at the door. "Listen," he said, his voice low and serious. "We don't talk about this to anyone. Got it?" I nodded, relieved that he wasn't going to brush it off or tell me I was imagining things. Whatever had happened in there, we had both experienced it. The drive home that night was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a ghostly child in the back seat. When I finally got home, I double-checked all the locks and left every light on in the house. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small measure of relief, but the events of the night still weighed heavily on me. I called in sick for my next shift, unable to face the thought of going back to that playground. To my surprise, Mike had done the same. When I finally did return to work a few days later, I learned that Mike had requested to be moved to the day shift permanently. I couldn't blame him. I was planning to do the same. The thought of being in that restaurant at night, knowing what might be lurking in the playground, was more than I could bear. In the weeks that followed, I kept expecting something else to happen. Maybe the ghostly child would follow me home, or I'd start hearing those awful sounds everywhere I went. But nothing did. Life went on as normal, except for the nightmares that plagued me almost every night. I've racked my brain trying to come up with a logical explanation for what happened that night. Maybe it was some kind of shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the creepy atmosphere. Maybe there was a malfunction in the sound system that created those terrifying noises. But deep down, I know those explanations don't cut it. What Mike and I experienced that night was something beyond the realm of normal explanation. The terror in that child's scream was too real, too visceral to have been a trick of technology or our imaginations. I've done some research since then, trying to find out if anyone else has had similar experiences in that McDonald's or others like it. I haven't found anything concrete, but there are whispers, stories of other fast food workers hearing strange sounds late at night, of playground equipment moving on its own, of shadowy figures seen darting through empty play areas. It makes me wonder, how many other places like this are out there? How many cheerful, innocent-looking playgrounds hide dark secrets? And most chillingly, what happened to the child whose screams we heard that night? I don't have answers to these questions, and part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that I'll never look at a fast food playground the same way again. And if you ever find yourself working a late shift in a place like that, my advice is this: don't go into the playground alone. And if you hear a child laughing when there shouldn't be any children around, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back, because some things are better left undisturbed, and some playgrounds are meant to stay empty once the sun goes down. Anyway, I was working the late shift one night, closing up after a busy dinner service. It was around 11 p.m. and I was the only one left in the restaurant. I was doing my final walkthrough, making sure everything was clean and put away for the night. As I was walking through the dining room, I suddenly got this weird feeling like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. But then I heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps coming from the hallway near the restrooms. My heart started racing. I knew I was alone in the building. I had just checked everywhere and locked all the doors. I called out, thinking maybe one of my staff had come back for something. But there was no response, just more footsteps. I reluctantly walked towards the hallway, my hand shaking as I flicked on the lights. As I rounded the corner, I froze in shock. There, at the end of the hall, I saw a pair of legs. Just legs, from the knees down. They were wearing crisp white pants and shiny black dress shoes, old-fashioned military uniform shoes. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But when I looked again, the legs were still there. They started walking towards me, each step echoing loudly in the empty hallway. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even speak. As the legs got closer, I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself. But when I opened them again and looked up, there was nothing there. The hallway was completely empty. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not even bothering to finish closing up. I sat in my car for a good 20 minutes, trying to calm down and make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to just quit on the spot, but I needed the job. So I forced myself to go back the next day, telling myself it was just my imagination. But weird things kept happening after that. Dishes would move on their own when no one was around. We'd hear whistling and humming coming from empty rooms. Customers would complain about feeling watched or touched by unseen hands. I started doing some research into the history of the old hospital. Turns out it had been used to treat badly wounded soldiers during World War II. Many didn't survive. There were stories of a particularly strict and cruel general who oversaw the hospital, known for mistreating patients and staff alike. The description of his uniform matched exactly what I had seen that night: white pants and shiny black dress shoes. I got chills, realizing it must have been his ghost I encountered. Things escalated over the next few weeks. Staff members quit left and right, refusing to work nights. We'd find tables set up for dinner service in the mornings, even though no one had been there. The sound of agonized moaning would echo through the building late at night. One evening, I was in the office doing paperwork when I heard a blood-curdling scream from the kitchen. I ran in to find one of our cooks sobbing hysterically. When she calmed down enough to speak, she said she'd seen a horrifically wounded soldier crawling across the floor, leaving a trail of blood. But when we looked, there was nothing there. That was the last straw for me. I put in my 2 weeks' notice the next day. On my last night closing up, I could have sworn I heard someone whisper goodbye right behind me as I was walking out. I didn't look back, just got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. I still drive by that restaurant sometimes. It's gone through several owners since then, never staying open for more than a few months. I've heard rumors that they're going to tear the building down soon. Part of me hopes they do. Maybe it will finally put those restless spirits to peace. But another part of me wonders if that will just make things worse, stirring up whatever darkness still lingers there. All I know is I'll never set foot in that place again. Some things are better left in the past, and some ghosts don't want to be disturbed. I just hope whoever takes over that property next knows what they're getting into, because those aren't just ghost stories. Trust me, it's all too real. I had always considered myself a skeptic when it came to the paranormal. Ghost stories and urban legends were just that, stories. But after what happened that day in Stanmore Park, I'm not so sure anymore. It was a typical dreary London afternoon in late October. My friends Ava, Demi, and I decided to take advantage of a brief break in the rain to get some fresh air at the park. We'd been cooped up studying for midterms and needed to clear our heads. The three of us had been close since starting uni together last year. Ava was the artistic one, always sketching in her notebook. Demi was our resident jokester, quick with a sarcastic quip, and I was the pragmatic one, grounding our little group. As we entered Stanmore Park, I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, and a light mist hung in the air, muffling the sounds of the city. We followed the main path, chatting about classes and plans for the weekend. About 15 minutes in, we veered onto a less traveled trail that wound deeper into the woods. That's when things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. I noticed the bird song and rustling leaves had faded away, leaving an eerie silence. When I mentioned it, Ava and Demi agreed it was strangely quiet. We laughed it off, saying the animals must be hiding from the cold. But as we continued walking, the silence became oppressive. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. An inexplicable feeling of dread settled in my stomach. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. The others nodded, looking uneasy. We turned to retrace our steps, picking up the pace. That's when I saw it, a flash of brilliant white light zipping through the trees, too fast to be a bird or drone. "Did you see that?" I gasped. Ava's eyes were wide as she nodded. Demi looked confused. "See what? I didn't—" She was cut off by another flash, closer this time. We all saw it and froze in place. The light hovered about 20 feet away, pulsing softly. It was roughly the size of a beach ball, but constantly shifting and swirling like liquid mercury. I felt rooted to the spot, heart racing. Part of me wanted to run, but another part was transfixed by the ethereal glow. Suddenly, the light blinked out. We stood in stunned silence for a moment before Ava whispered, "What the hell was that?" Before anyone could answer, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. That broke the spell. We took off, running down the path, leaves crunching under our feet. I could hear Ava and Demi's ragged breathing behind me as we fled. After a few minutes of frantic sprinting, we slowed to catch our breath. The silence from earlier was gone, replaced by a cacophony of unnatural sounds, metallic screeching, low rumbling growls, and what sounded like whispered voices speaking in an unknown language. "We need to get out of here," Demi panted. Ava and I nodded in agreement. But as we started moving again, I realized something was very wrong. The path we'd been on had vanished. We were surrounded by dense forest on all sides, with no sign of which way led out. "This is impossible," I muttered, spinning in a circle. "We couldn't have gotten that far off track." Ava pulled out her phone. "I'll use GPS to—" Shit, no signal. Demi and I checked our phones too. No service, and the batteries were rapidly draining despite being fully charged earlier. A twig snapped nearby, and we all jumped. Peering into the gloom, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A pale, elongated hand gripping a tree trunk, fingers unnaturally long and jointed. It retreated as soon as I spotted it. "Did you see?" I started to ask, but was cut off by Ava's terrified shriek. She was pointing at something behind me. I whirled around to see a figure standing about 50 feet away. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall and thin, with limbs at odd angles. Its skin was a sickly grayish-white that seemed to absorb the little light filtering through the trees. What haunts me most is that it had no face, just smooth, featureless skin where features should be. Yet I could feel it watching us intently. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Ava and Demi's arms. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping our faces as we fled blindly through the woods. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish forest. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but sheer terror kept me going. Eventually we burst out of the tree line, stumbling onto a grassy field. I looked around wildly, expecting to see that faceless thing in pursuit, but there was nothing there. just an empty park on a gloomy afternoon. We had somehow ended up on the opposite side of Stanmore Park from where we entered. The normal sounds of birds and distant traffic had returned. If it wasn't for our muddy clothes and scratched skin, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole ordeal. As we caught our breath, I did a head count and felt a fresh wave of panic. "Where's Demi?" Ava looked around frantically. "She was right behind me, I swear." We shouted Demi's name, searching the edge of the woods, but there was no sign of her. My hands shook as I finally got cell service and called the police. The next few hours were a blur of questions from stone-faced officers who clearly didn't believe our wild story. They organized a search party, but found no trace of Demi or anything unusual in the woods. 3 days later, Demi reappeared. She showed up at her flat, claiming she had no memory of what happened after we entered the park. Physically, she seemed fine, but something was off. Her eyes looked somehow flatter, less alive. Her voice was monotone, and she barely reacted to our tearful reunion. I tried to talk to her about what happened, but she shut down any mention of that day. Within a week, she had withdrawn from uni and moved back home. She blocked me and Ava on all social media. It's been 6 months, and I still have nightmares about what we saw in those woods. I've tried to convince myself it was some kind of shared hallucination or elaborate hoax, but deep down, I know what we experienced was real. Sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can hear those alien whispers again, and out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of a tall, thin silhouette watching me from the shadows. I don't go to parks anymore. I was always a bit of an outdoorsy type, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that hiking trip with my son last summer. We'd been planning it for weeks, just a simple day hike through one of the state parks in the Ohio River Valley. Jake had just turned 10, and I figured he was old enough for his first real hike. The day started out perfect. Clear blue skies, a light breeze, temperature in the mid-70s. We packed our day packs with trail mix, water bottles, and a first aid kit. Jake was so excited he could barely sit still on the drive to the trailhead. I remember thinking how great it was to see him enthusiastic about something other than video games for once. We hit the trail around 9 a.m. The first couple miles were uneventful, just your typical forest scenery. Tall oak and maple trees, the occasional chipmunk scurrying across our path. Jake kept pointing out different plants and asking what they were. I tried my best to remember what little I knew from my Boy Scout days. It was probably around the 3-mile mark when things started to feel off. I can't explain it, but the forest suddenly felt different, quieter. The birds had stopped chirping and even the wind seemed to die down. I brushed it off at first, figuring it was just my imagination. But then Jake tugged on my sleeve. "Dad, did you see that?" he whispered, pointing off to our left. I looked where he was pointing but didn't see anything unusual. "See what, buddy?" "I thought I saw something move behind that big tree over there, like a shadow or something." I squinted, trying to spot what he was talking about. "I don't see anything, Jake. Probably just a deer or something." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. We kept walking, but I noticed Jake staying closer to me than before. Not long after that, I started to get an unsettling feeling that we were being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was like that, but all over. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the bushes. But there was never anything there. I was starting to get seriously freaked out, but I didn't want to scare Jake. I suggested we take a quick break to have some water and trail mix. As we sat on a fallen log, I heard what sounded like whispers coming from somewhere in the forest. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it definitely wasn't the wind. "Hey, Dad, do you hear that?" Jake asked, his eyes wide. My blood ran cold, so it wasn't just me imagining things. Yeah, buddy. Probably just other hikers nearby," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. But I knew that wasn't true. We hadn't seen another soul on the trail all day. I stood up abruptly. "You know what? I think we should start heading back. It's getting late and I don't want us to get caught out here after dark." Jake looked confused. "But Dad, it's only like 1 o'clock. You said we'd do the whole loop." I know, but I just remembered I have an important work call later. We'll come back another time and finish it, okay?" He seemed disappointed but didn't argue. As we started back the way we came, that feeling of being watched intensified. I could have sworn I saw shadows moving in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The whispers got louder too. Still unintelligible, but definitely there. Jake must have heard them too because he grabbed my hand and held on tight. I wanted to run, but I was afraid of spooking whatever was out there. So we just walked as quickly as we could without actually breaking into a jog. About a mile from the trailhead, I heard a twig snap loudly behind us. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and look, but something deep inside told me that would be a terrible mistake. "Jake," I said in a low, urgent voice, "I need you to do exactly what I say, okay? Don't ask questions, just listen." He nodded, eyes wide with fear. "We're going to walk a little faster now, but no matter what happens, do not look behind us, understand? Keep your eyes forward." "Oh, okay, Dad," he stammered. We picked up the pace, practically speed walking now. The whispers had turned into a low, constant murmur that seemed to be getting closer. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see more shadows flitting between the trees. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Jake's breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps. "Dad, I'm scared," he whimpered. "It's okay, buddy. We're almost there. Just keep walking and don't look back." The murmuring was right behind us now. I could feel something reaching for us. The air felt thick and heavy, like trying to move through molasses. Every step was a struggle. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, the trees thinned out and I saw the parking lot ahead. With a burst of desperate energy, I scooped Jake up and sprinted the last 100 yards to the car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door unlocked. As soon as we were inside, I slammed the locks down and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. Jake was crying in the passenger seat. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "It's okay, buddy. We're safe now. Everything's gonna be all right." But even as I said it, I glanced in the rearview mirror. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. There, at the edge of the forest, was a mass of writhing shadows. They seemed to pulse and shift, never taking a solid form. And in the center of it all were two glowing red eyes, staring directly at us as we sped away. I didn't slow down until we were miles away from that cursed forest. When we finally got home, I hugged Jake for a long time, grateful we had made it out. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes. Jake doesn't like to talk about what happened, but sometimes I catch him staring out the window with a haunted look. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. We're never going hiking again. It was my best friend, Jake's birthday party. His family had recently moved into this big old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The place had a bit of a reputation for being strange. There were always rumors about weird noises and lights seen on the property. But Jake's parents got it for a steal, and they laughed off all the local gossip. The party started off normal enough. About 15 of us kids were there, playing games, eating cake, the usual. As it got dark, some of the older kids started talking about exploring the property. Jake's backyard backed up to this huge, overgrown field, with an old barn and some thick stands of bamboo at the edges. I was hesitant at first. I've always been a bit of a scaredy cat, if I'm honest. But peer pressure got the better of me, and I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of my crush, Lizzie. So I reluctantly agreed to join the group, venturing out into the darkness. There were 6 of us, me, Jake, Lizzie, and 3 other kids from our class. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and headed out across the field towards the barn. The grass was wet with dew, and I remember the beam of my flashlight catching all these little water droplets, making them sparkle eerily. As we approached the barn, I started to get a sick feeling in my stomach. Something just felt off. The air seemed heavier somehow and unnaturally still. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. Jake wanted to go inside the barn, but the door was padlocked. Instead, we decided to check out this dense patch of bamboo off to the side. As we got closer, I swear I saw something move in the shadows between the tall stalks. I tried to shine my light on it, but there was nothing there. We were about to turn back when suddenly there was this awful screeching sound. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. Before I could even process what was happening, something slammed into me from behind, knocking me face first into the mud. I heard the others screaming and scrambling around me. As I struggled to my feet, I felt something brush past me, something big and fast moving. But I couldn't see anything there, just flashes of movement in my periphery, always vanishing when I tried to look directly at it. Jake was yelling for us to run. I grabbed Lizzie's hand and we booked it back towards the house as fast as we could. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding after us, getting closer and closer. Just as we reached the edge of the yard, Lizzie tripped and fell. I turned to help her up, and that's when I saw it. 2 enormous glowing red eyes, easily 7 feet off the ground, staring right at us from the darkness. They blinked once, slowly, and I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me unlike anything I've ever experienced. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the eyes vanished. Lizzie and I scrambled to our feet and sprinted the rest of the way back to the house. We burst through the back door, gasping and crying. Jake's parents came running to see what was wrong. We tried to explain what had happened, but it all came out as a jumbled, hysterical mess. Jake's dad went outside to investigate, but of course found nothing. They assumed we had just spooked ourselves in the dark and let our imaginations run wild. But I know what I saw. And in the weeks that followed, strange things kept happening around that property. Livestock going missing. Weird lights in the windows of the barn at night. Jake's family ended up moving out less than 6 months later. I've talked to the others who were there that night over the years. Some of them have convinced themselves it was just a prank or a shared hallucination. But Lizzie and I, we know the truth. Something was out there in that field. Something that didn't want us there. To this day, I can't look at bamboo without getting chills. And sometimes, late at night, I still see those red eyes when I close my own, watching me from the darkness. I don't know what it was we encountered that night. Some kind of cryptid, an alien, a demon. I'm not sure I want to know, but I do know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edges of what we understand. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble into their domain. I haven't been back to that property since that night. I heard it sat abandoned for years after Jake's family left. Recently, a developer bought it and tore everything down to build new houses. Part of me hopes that whatever was there is gone now, but another part of me worries that by disturbing that land, they might have awakened something that was better left sleeping. All I know for certain is that the world is a stranger and more terrifying place than most people realize. That night changed me forever. I no longer take comfort in the idea that science can explain everything. I've seen firsthand that there are forces and entities out there beyond our comprehension. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better not to know, to have remained blissfully ignorant of the horrors that exist just beyond the veil of our everyday reality. But then I remember those glowing red eyes, and I know that ignorance is no protection. The monsters are real, whether we choose to believe in them or not. I still have nightmares about that night. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced that something is watching me from the dark corners of my room. It's been over 20 years, but the fear is as fresh as ever. I've tried to research similar encounters, looking for any explanation of what we might have experienced. I found a few stories that sound eerily similar. Strange creatures with glowing eyes, invisible forces attacking people in wooded areas, but nothing conclusive. There are times I've considered reaching out to paranormal investigators or cryptozoologists, but then I think, what good would it do? Even if they believed me, what could they possibly do? And part of me is terrified that by looking too deeply into it, I might draw the attention of whatever it was we encountered that night. So I keep the story to myself for the most part. But sometimes, like now, I feel compelled to share it. Maybe as a warning, maybe in the hopes that someone out there has answers, or maybe just to remind myself that it really happened, that I'm not crazy. To anyone reading this who might be tempted to go looking for thrills in supposedly haunted places, be careful. You might find more than you bargained for. There are things out there in the dark that we were never meant to understand. Things that can change you forever with just a glance from their glowing red eyes. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that night, but I do know that I'll never forget it. It's a part of me now, for better or worse. A constant reminder that the world is far more mysterious and dangerous than we like to believe. So the next time you're out at night and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts. Run, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your flashlight beam, waiting for you to stumble into its grasp. My usual route took me across the Burlington Street Bridge and then onto the pedestrian path that ran alongside the river. I'd circle back via the railroad bridge near the art building. It wasn't strictly allowed, but lots of students used it as a shortcut, and I'd never had any issues. That night started like any other. It was a cool, clear evening in early October. The air had that crisp fall feeling that made running feel effortless. I was about halfway through my usual 5-mile loop when I reached the railroad bridge. The bridge itself was pretty basic, just a metal structure spanning the river with wooden planks forming a walkway between the tracks. There were no lights on the bridge itself, but the glow from nearby buildings provided enough illumination to see where I was going. As I started across, I noticed how still and dark the water looked below. The river was usually pretty calm here, but tonight it seemed almost glassy. I paused for a moment, leaning against the railing to catch my breath and take in the night air. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a bit of debris floating by, but then I realized it was moving against the current. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a large, dark shape gliding through the water. My first thought was that it must be a big fish, maybe a catfish or carp, but as I watched, I realized this thing was way too big to be any fish I'd ever seen in the Iowa River. It had to be at least 5 or 6 feet long. I leaned further over the railing, squinting to get a better look. The creature was moving slowly, almost lazily, just under the surface. Its shape was odd, bulky in the middle, tapering to a long, thick tail. For a moment, I wondered if it could be a beaver or river otter. We had those in Iowa, though I'd never seen one this big. But something about the way it moved just seemed off. Then it turned, and I saw its head. My blood ran cold. This thing had a massive bulbous head, easily twice the size of what would be proportional for its body. It reminded me of those deep-sea fish with bioluminescent lures, except this was no fish. As it turned, 2 gleaming eyes caught the light. They were huge, far larger than any animal's eyes should be, and they were looking directly at me. I froze, unable to look away. The creature's gaze seemed to pin me in place. There was an intelligence in those eyes that sent chills down my spine. This wasn't just some animal. It felt like it was studying me. For several long seconds we stared at each other. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to run, but I couldn't seem to make my legs move. Then, without warning, the creature dove. It happened so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. 1 second it was there, the next, gone. There wasn't even a ripple on the water's surface. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. My eyes scanned the dark water, looking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the same eerily still surface as before. Finally, I managed to shake off my paralysis. I practically sprinted the rest of the way across the bridge, constantly glancing over my shoulder. It wasn't until I reached the well-lit paths of campus that I slowed down. As my adrenaline faded, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a weird optical illusion, I told myself, or some kind of large fish I'd never heard of before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I spent hours that night researching local wildlife, trying to find anything that matched what I'd seen. But nothing came close. The closest I could find were stories of the Loveland frog, a cryptid supposedly spotted in Ohio. But those descriptions didn't quite fit either. Over the next few weeks, I changed my running route to avoid the river entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching me. Even now, years later, I get goosebumps thinking about it. I've told a few people about what happened, but most just laugh it off or assume I was seeing things. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But sometimes, when I'm back in Iowa City visiting friends, I'll find myself drawn to that old railroad bridge. I'll stand there, staring into the dark water below, and wonder, what if it's still down there, waiting? I never saw the creature again after that night. Part of me is relieved, but another part almost wishes I had. At least then I'd know for sure I wasn't going crazy. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself more hesitant around bodies of water now, always scanning the surface for any unusual movement. I've developed a fascination with cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena, wondering what other secrets might be hiding just out of sight. But mostly, I'm left with questions. What was that thing? Where did it come from, and where did it go? Are there more like it out there? I don't have any answers. All I know is that for one brief moment on a cool October night, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. And I'll never forget those eyes, staring back at me from the depths of the Iowa River. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it. I've scoured local news archives and online forums, looking for any similar reports. But so far, I haven't found anything concrete. Either I'm the only one who's encountered this creature, or others are just as hesitant to come forward as I've been. I've thought about reporting it to wildlife officials or even reaching out to cryptozoology researchers. But what would I even say? I saw a giant, unidentifiable creature with a massive head in the Iowa River. I'd probably be laughed out of the room. So I've kept it mostly to myself, turning the experience over and over in my mind. Every detail is seared into my memory. The glossy surface of the water, the strange, undulating movement of the creature's body, and those haunting, intelligent eyes. I find myself wondering about the creature's life. Does it live in the river full time, or was it just passing through? What does it eat? Are there others like it? The questions are endless, and I know I'll probably never get answers. In the years since, I've become much more attuned to the natural world around me. I pay closer attention to the creatures I encounter, always half expecting to see something extraordinary. Every unexplained splash or movement in water makes my heart race, wondering if I'll catch another glimpse of the impossible. I've also developed a deep respect for the unknown. That night showed me that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist beyond our current understanding. It's humbling and a little terrifying to realize how much we still don't know about the world around us. Sometimes I dream about the creature. In my dreams, I'm back on that bridge, but this time the creature speaks to me. The words are always garbled and forgotten when I wake up, leaving me with a lingering sense of unfinished business. I've thought about going back to that spot at night to see if I can spot it again. But something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's the knowledge that you can't recreate a moment like that. It happened once, defying all logic and reason, and that's where it will stay. So I'm left with this story, this one incredible encounter that I can't fully explain or forget. It's become a part of me, shaping how I see the world and reminding me that there's always more to discover if we're willing to look. To anyone reading this who might have had a similar experience, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know. All we can do is keep our eyes open and our minds ready for the unexpected. And to that creature, if you're somehow able to understand this, thank you. Thank you for showing me that the world is stranger and more wonderful than I ever imagined. I hope you're out there somewhere, still swimming in the depths, still defying explanation. And maybe, just maybe, one day, our paths will cross again.